I wrote the first edition of this book in the summer of 2020 at Oxford University. The intention was to write a brief academic book, but without academic jargon, so that it could be read, or in this case listened to, by anyone interested in the big ethical questions raised by new genetic technologies like embryo selection and gene editing. While the book raises moral questions, it is not moralizing in any sense of that word. I don't come to strong moral conclusions. I try to leave that for the readers after I've covered the basic science and have made some moral distinctions and then drawn out some economic implications. I'm going to start with a quick preface, and then I'll read through each of the main 4 chapters. They're very short, and each of which focuses on a different form of enhancement. So the first chapter is on cognitive enhancement, the second on moral dispositions, the third on health, and then the fourth on enhancing beauty. I'll end with a conclusion, which considers how the choices that we make now will influence the welfare of people in the distant future. We all want people to flourish. We want our children to be healthy and happy, and we want them to live meaningful lives. Over the past few centuries, we've remade our environment by altering ecosystems and modifying crops. We've changed how our children think with compulsory education, and we've altered their immune system with vaccines and antibiotics. So the real question is, apart from environmental interventions that are aimed to improve our children's prospects, should we also genetically modify our children or genetically select them when we have a set of embryos? New forms of biomedical technology will soon enable parents to exercise much more direct control over the traits of their kids. Pre-implantation genetic testing, sometimes called PGT, already allows us to screen embryos in order to reduce the risk of monogenic diseases. Those are diseases caused by a single gene, like cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs. And we can do some polygenic diseases like diabetes, breast cancer, schizophrenia. But soon, parents are going to be able to select embryos for mental traits like intelligence, personality traits, even aesthetic traits like height, eye color, possibly even skin and hair color. How does PGT work? Well, when women go through IVF, they typically generate more eggs than they need, especially if they're young and fertile. When eggs and sperm are combined to create embryos, the embryos are genetically sequenced, and then statistical models allow us to assign each embryo a polygenic risk score. Polygenic risk scores indicate the likelihood that an embryo will develop a set of traits ranging from, again, brown hair to diabetes. Polygenic scores are created from genome-wide association studies, sometimes called GWAS for short, and basically a genome-wide association study comes from genotyping large numbers of people by simply sequencing them genetically, and then phenotyping them by gauging their outward expressed traits like their height, their mental ability, and so on. These traits can then be associated or correlated with specific genetic variants, and with enough people and enough associations, we can generate scores that assign to each embryo a particular likelihood that they'll develop these conditions or these traits. Some have argued that we can't know whether polygenic predictions work until an embryo reaches adulthood. So maybe we would need hundreds of thousands of people, and then we see how they end up in 20 years, 50 years, 80 years. But this is wrong. If polygenic scores have predictive validity, they should not only be able to predict the traits that an embryo will eventually develop if it's implanted, they should also be able to predict the traits that existing siblings have. After all, brothers and sisters are genetically related in the same way embryos in a petri dish are. They share the same parents and about the same amount of kinship, roughly half their genes. The question is really not whether polygenic scores work, but how well they work. And that's just going to depend on the trait in question and the quality of data that we happen to have at the time. Scores are getting better and better every year, and we already have decent scores for mental ability and lots of physical traits. It's important to stress that polygenic scores are probabilistic. This is because traits that are polygenic, the kinds of traits that these scores predict, emerge from the interaction of hundreds or even thousands of genetic variants. These are sometimes called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. The acronym doesn't matter as much as the fact that these are small genetic variants and they're adding up across hundreds or thousands in order to produce a probability of some trait. Most SNPs are additive, meaning that each of them contributes just a little bit to a trait like height. But some SNPs are rare genetic variants that have much larger effects than normal ones, and thus they contribute more dramatically to a a trait. So just to take an example, while many genes influence the probability that a woman will develop breast cancer or ovarian cancer, there are single variants like BRCA1 and BRCA2 that substantially elevate the risk of breast cancer, maybe 40% if the woman has it. But again, most genes aren't like that. Most are contributing just a tiny bit to an overall risk. So far, embryo selection is limited by the still young science of genetics and the small number of eggs that women can generate through induced ovulation, that is, through IVF. But there are two reasons this is going to change very quickly. The first is machine learning, which is a weak form of artificial intelligence, is accelerating our understanding of what genes do and how they interact to shape traits. Second, a newly discovered technique allows us to take any somatic cell, take a blood or a skin cell, for example, and turn it into a pluripotent stem cell from which we can create eggs. So the idea here is you take an adult cell, you in effect reverse age it, revert it back to the state in which it could have become any kind of cell. And if you can do that, well, then you can create an egg cell. And this is important because it's going to allow us to create huge numbers of embryos potentially without requiring that women do IVF, and thereby providing a lot of genetic diversity from which parents can choose. After all, men make millions of sperm every day, but women create relatively few eggs, especially as they get older. So IVG, as this is called, in vitro gametogenesis, has the capacity to dramatically change the way that we reproduce. Selecting a spouse or a sperm or egg donor will determine which genetic combinations are possible, but more eggs means more embryos and thus more genetic variation from which to select. This is why IVG, in vitro gametogenesis, is going to be transformative. Apart from selecting embryos based on their genetic profile, gene editing tools like CRISPR and some of its more recent descendants are probably going to allow us to delete novel mutations, most of which are harmful, that occur during a normal human lifetime. But they're also going to be able to eventually, likely, dramatically edit entire embryos, or at least large sections of them, so that we not only can edit out particular genes that put us at risk of some disease, but also change the nature of the traits that we have. Visionary biologists like Craig Venter and George Church, who first sequenced the human genome, they go even further. They see a distant future in which we can create children from scratch by writing a genetic code and constructing a synthetic genome from common amino acid. And in fact, this is more than hypothetical, as I'll mention in the final chapter. This has already been done by Craig Venter for a really simple bacterium. And if it's been done for a bacterium, it's just a little bit more difficult to do it for a person. The moral and political questions raised by these kinds of technologies are as profound as any that our species have ever faced and probably will ever face. The risks are significant, but the possible benefits are quite large. So each chapter in this book is going to advance arguments for enhancing traits that might benefit future people. What I'm not going to do is cover some of the, what I consider more boring mainstream debates on genetic enhancement. Is this playing God or so on? I mean, a lot of people have talked about this. Of course, we're already playing God when we administer vaccines, when we extend life, and so on. If you're religious and you think that is an objection that's decisive, there's probably not much more to talk about, because if it's playing God and it's wrong, then we shouldn't do it. However, I think that a lot of people are going to be quite comfortable with using insights from genetics to shape the traits of their kids. So I am going to focus on some of the more neglected issues in the debate so far, what I consider to be the really big and interesting issues, including collective action problems. These are cases where the reproductive choices of each affect the welfare of all. So for example, you could imagine that each child would benefit from an enhancement that confers immunity to particular diseases that threaten the current population. But also, you can imagine, all of us would be better off with more immunodiversity in the population. After all, I'm going to argue in the final chapter, that's why sex evolved for multicellular organisms like us. It evolved so that we could have at the population level more immunodiversity. Adaptive immune systems go some way in helping solve that problem, but ultimately we wouldn't want a set of people to make exactly the same choices, and then if a new microbe evolved, they'd all be susceptible to the same germ. Now, how would we solve the problem? Are parents likely to voluntarily look at what other people are doing and then adjust their decisions accordingly so that it's collectively harmonious? Or will we need new laws, new norms, new ways of informing choice with information? What are the moral advantages of relying on free choice in comparison with different kinds of restrictions? Similar questions arise for enhancing cognitive or personality traits like empathy, self-control, extroversion. All of these are strongly influenced by genes, and to some extent, it's good to have a diversity of personality traits, cognitive styles, etc. in the population. In a world in which the genetic endowment of our children does so much to influence their prospects, it's likely, I think, that black markets for genetic enhancement will thrive, especially if governments attempt to restrict them. And this makes these kinds of problems especially interesting because if we have a collective action problem and it's not clear people are going to choose in ways that are good for social welfare overall, and they're going to be drawn to make these kinds of choices anyway, these kinds of enhancements, it's not clear that people who are creeped out by this technology will want to simply say, well, I'm not going to do this for my kid, or I'm going to make it illegal. Making it illegal will almost certainly benefit the rich and well-connected, while it actually increases inequalities by harming the relatively poorly connected and poor. So this fact is going to influence the feasibility of regulating the market for technologies that allow us to select and alter embryos. Chapter 1, Smart People. According to the Greek myths, Prometheus was punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to people. It's fairly clear that fire for the Greeks symbolized the arts and the sciences, which are the fruit of our cognitive faculties. And one of the things that this myth tells us is that people are in a way ambivalent about intelligence. The gods are covetous of it and people want it. We understand that intelligence is a trait that distinguishes us from other animals. And of course, most of us wish we were smarter, or at least wiser or wittier, better at parties, telling jokes, and so on. And intelligence enables these things. But many people also think of high intelligence as a curse, in part maybe because it allows us to see the imperfections of the world, things that we can't change, and that we might focus on if we can perceive them. In this chapter, I'm going to give an overview of the individual and social benefits of intelligence. I'm going to define intelligence, and then I'm going to consider worries that some people have about boosting intelligence, as well as discussing the trade-offs that parents will face when they're selecting specific cognitive traits. I'll end by considering the possibilities that these genetic technologies, gene editing, embryo selection, will facilitate so much inequality in cognitive ability that we'll end up with unequal moral status. That is a serious worry. And unfortunately, I'm going to argue that despite the benefits, there's really no way around this problem. Technologies that allow us to transform our children's abilities will be in such high demand that a prohibitive approach is going to be virtually impossible. It will end up actually producing the opposite of its intended effects. So what is intelligence? Intelligence is puzzling. After all, if it's so important, why didn't other primates, let alone other kinds of animals, develop it to the extent that we did? I mean, one limiting factor is obvious. It's metabolically expensive to maintain the biological machinery that makes intelligence possible. Given how unusual high intelligence is in the animal kingdom, combined with the fact that the size of an average human brain tripled in only 3 million years, there must have been really unusual selection pressures that favored its growth. Among these are probably the early tendency for humans to hunt and live cooperatively, and the consequent need to coordinate our actions with others and draw up complex plans. In cases like this, you can imagine, people who are a bit dimmer are simply not going to be able to cut it. They're not going to remember the plans. They're not going to understand the cues. And so through natural selection, they simply die off relative to their smarter brothers and sisters, so to speak. Once intelligence became especially important for human survival and social coordination, it's plausible. Some people like Jeffrey Miller have argued, it's plausible to suppose that it became sexually selected, a little bit like a peacock's tail. It's strange to think of the brain as an attractive ornament, like a tail, but it's easy to see how the creative displays that large brains enable might indicate to a potential partner one's ability to solve socially important problems. And in fact, this is probably an honest signal that that's very hard to fake. On this view, we find jokes funny, complex stories compelling, in part because the ability to recognize superior creative displays of intelligence would have been crucial for the survival of our ancestors. Once this became true, it's possible that sexual selection favored big brains by making signs of intelligence attractive beyond their ability to solve mundane problems. Cultural norms may have also affected which kinds of creative display were especially attractive. And so we get this kind of coevolutionary process, so that gene-culture coevolution may have increased intelligence among some groups by directing people to seek out smart mates. But what exactly is intelligence? An influential view comes from the intelligence scholar Linda Gottfredson at the University of Delaware, who argued that intelligence is not the amount of information people know, but rather their ability to recognize, acquire, organize, update, select, and apply information effectively. Put more positively, intelligence is the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. That's Linda Gottfredson's view. That's a mouthful. That's a lot going on there, but this view isn't supposed to be controversial. Instead, it's supposed to capture the sort of rich set of traits that intelligence is. Again, think about reasoning, learning from ideas, memory, quickly solving problems, and so on. Yet for some people, apparently I think for political reasons, they want to deny that intelligence is real, that it's strongly influenced by genes, and that it can predict important life outcomes. I think this reluctance to accept the results of intelligence research, which is now a century old, probably comes from a fear that if intelligence is mostly a function of genetics, and intelligence is unevenly distributed in the human population, egalitarian political ideals are hopeless, at least if we interpret equality in certain ways. It may also stem from the sense that it's just cosmically unfair that nature would dole out abilities so unequally. I mean, we all recognize it's just all too obvious that some people are taller than others, better looking, more athletic. But with intelligence, there's some plausible deniability. We might say, well, yeah, but who knows? We can't really see it directly. Anything's possible. And it's just unfair that some people are born smarter than others. There are a few responses to this kind of political motivation for resisting intelligence research. The first is, of course, that whether something is true and whether we'd like to believe it are two different things. The second is, and I'm going to discuss this in the final section of the first chapter, whether intelligence differences undermine equality depends on what we mean by equality. And finally, if the conclusions of intelligence research are inconsistent with a certain form of egalitarianism, we may actually have a choice. For the first time in history, we can either revise our moral commitments or alter people. There's no need to lie to ourselves or to other people about the data. After all, if the premise of this book is right, we're soon going to be able to alter the traits of future people in ways that better satisfy our moral commitments. Political worries aside, intelligence is real, it's measurable, and it's fairly stable across time. In written version of this book, I have extensive references that you can look up. Intelligence quotients, or IQ tests, are imperfect but powerful ways of gauging cognitive ability. And although there are different kinds of IQ tests, the results generally correlate so highly that psychologists talk about general cognitive ability, or G for short. Informally, we would just say someone's smart or he's intelligent. What they do is they call it G. Scores on G-loaded IQ tests, as they call them, predict a host of important life outcomes. According to a really influential recent review, intelligence, or cognitive ability, predicts educational outcomes, occupational outcomes, and health outcomes better than any other trait. IQ is negatively correlated with crime, so that if you have a higher IQ, you're less likely to commit crimes even after we adjust that for socioeconomic status. And IQ is positively correlated with income, which is probably a little bit less surprising. Really surprising, though, is that high average intelligence in a population predicts higher social trust and economic development. Smarter countries have less corruption and more wealth. And this probably has something to do with not intelligence per se, but the fact that intelligence is often correlated with self-control and long time horizons. And people who have more self-control, longer time horizons, they tend to see the value of cooperating in the short run, following rules that restrict their liberty in the short run, but that yield long-term advantages. Intelligence is also highly heritable. Although scientists are just now finding specific genetic variants associated with intelligence, we know a remarkable amount about the extent to which intelligence is influenced by genes. This knowledge comes from behavioral genetics, which began as an attempt to infer the heritability of traits by observing behavior in the absence of any knowledge of the biochemistry that causes it. And you might wonder, how can we do this? Well, behavioral genetics was born when Francis Galton began studying twins separated at birth in order to sort out the effects of nature and nurture on personality. And you can think of twins, of course, in two ways. There are fraternal twins, which only share half their genes. They happen to be born at the same time, but they're from different genetic embryos. And then there are, of course, identical twins, which are just genetic copies of each other. It's when one embryo accidentally clones itself, more or less, and you end up with two people with the exact same genetics. So the idea then is if they happen to be raised apart, and now people are doing this on purpose, they're studying them on purpose, but back then, if they were raised apart, you could find them and figure out how alike they were to each other. So the methods for doing this, for measuring traits, have improved considerably, and the number of twins studied throughout their life course is now in the tens of thousands. The first rigorous studies of twins began in the 1970s, and now we have 5 decades of research including thousands of papers published in peer-reviewed journals. In fact, intelligence is among the most carefully studied traits in psychology, and it's one of the few areas of psychology that's highly replicable. The idea here is many aspects of psychology, the social sciences, and humanities, especially the ones that have political implications, there are trendy topics and people are pressured to come to specific conclusions. But then when you look back 10 years, 20 years, you can't actually replicate the results. That's not true with intelligence research. It turns out the results there have been stable for decades now. Behavioral genetics researchers have also studied many other traits, ranging from health and height to political ideology and religiosity. Shockingly, these are also heritable traits, in order to figure out exactly which portion of them can be traced to nature and nurture. It's worth mentioning that heritability in the technical sense gauges the extent to which genes explain the differences between individuals in a given population. Heritability is not a measure of how genetic a trait is per se, and the reason for this is a bit technical. There's no fixed number that indicates exactly how much of a trait is a function of nature or nurture. And this is because genes interact with different environments and with random developmental forces to produce traits. So take an example, a population that includes some very well-fed people, so they're healthy, they have enough nutrition and so on, and then some really malnourished people might have a lower heritability score for height than a population would if everyone was malnourished or everyone was well-fed. So you've got one population that's a combination of well-fed and poorly fed. Then you've got a second population, everyone's well-fed. And then the third population, everyone is poorly fed or malnourished. And what you get, remarkably enough, is different heritability scores. And again, this is reflecting the fact that basically, these environmental determinants can actually have some significant effect on various life outcomes, height, intelligence, and so on. The famous example for height is during World War II, when the Dutch were starved for a season by the Nazis. The generation of children born by the mothers who were pregnant at that time were significantly shorter. I don't remember the exact score, maybe a couple of inches shorter than the average Dutch person. And so what that shows is in that uneven environment where some people probably had plenty to eat and lots of them didn't, you just get much more variation. And in that case, also, it's going to be a shorter average. Nevertheless, at the risk of oversimplifying, heritability scores can be thought of as indicating roughly how strongly genes influence traits. This is especially true if you're dealing with populations like the modern West, Canada, United States, Germany, or places like Japan or Korea, where pretty much everyone is hitting the basic threshold that you need for nutrition, minimal levels of education, pretty much universal literacy. Once you hit those thresholds, heritability scores really do start to look like how genetic a trait is. As it turns out, across a wide variety of populations, intelligence is about 60 to 80% heritable by adulthood. And what that means is, on average, genetics explains about 60 to 80% of the variation in intelligence between adults within a population. Personality traits like the Big Five, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, sometimes abbreviated OCEAN, right? OCEAN. So that's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. These are about 50% heritable. And while this does leave substantial room for environmental influence and probably some as developmental influence in the womb and so on, the nurture side of the nature-nurture equation can be a little bit misleading. It does not mean that parents and peers determine the non-genetic parts of our intelligence or personality. Environments play a role, to be sure, but genetic predispositions actually lead us to seek out and actively shape our environments from an early age. This is a crucial point, sometimes called the nature of nurture, as opposed to nurture and nature being separate. According to one of the pioneers of twin studies and behavioral genetics, Robert Plomin, and I'm quoting, "Psychological environments are not, quote, out there, imposed on us passively. They are in here, experienced by us as we actively perceive, interpret, select, modify, and even create environments correlated with our genetic propensities. For example," he goes on to say, "genetic differences in children's aptitudes and appetites affect the extent to which they take advantage of educational opportunities. If you're already born with some musical aptitudes, for example, you're going to be drawn toward music probably, especially if you're rewarded for it. And so you already have these abilities that are pretty good, that differentiate you from other people, and then you're drawn to recreate your environment so that you develop those abilities even more. And the same is going to be true for extroversion, for quantitative intelligence, and lots of other other things. Robert Plomin even goes as far as to say that the schools our parents send us to do not make much difference in the development of our aptitudes, even if they do help shape our worldview and our values. Instead, and I'm quoting, he says, "The most important thing that our parents give to their child is their genes." Apart from the individual advantages of intelligence, which I've already discussed, there are substantial social benefits. In some ways, it's obvious why a nation with especially smart people would be more likely to succeed than others, or a team or a company with really bright people. Intelligent people who are given the opportunity to make full use of their talents will tend to produce more scientific and technical innovations. But one of the most surprising findings that's emerged from intelligence research is that groups of smart people tend to cooperate more, and thus create the conditions for living together productively in a political society or a country. Economists have long understood that formal political institutions and informal norms, social norms, are important sources of social order. They're the background against which trade is likely to be productive or unproductive. And in societies full of free riders and corrupt politicians, it's going to be a lot harder to tell friend from foe, and more dangerous to invest in risky ventures that might have social benefits, but which are likely to result in personal failure. So if you've got stable institutions, for example, and you can predict the future with a little bit more accuracy, well, you're more likely to invest in that future. And when lots of people are doing that, well, the country is going to tend to be richer and better off. Trust changes everything. Economists focus a lot on trust. High trust societies in which laws are impartially applied and private property rights are enforced are the most productive in the world. There are lots of charts you can look up. You can, take a break from the book and Google this. Just look at the correlation between trust and high trust societies on the one hand and GDP or productivity on the other, and you'll find it's pretty strong. Countries with a high average IQ and with high social trust tend to be correlated, and it probably goes in both directions. According to Garrett Jones, while intelligence predicts cooperation and collective action problems, traits that correlate with intelligence, especially patience, seem to be a large part of why smart people tend to cooperate more. It's not that smart people have better moral motivations, they almost certainly don't. Instead, smart people in high IQ groups tend to find each other, to employ mutually beneficial strategies in complex interactions, and to support policies that reinforce political institutions that increase prosperity. All of this suggests that parents have a moral reason to boost their children's intelligence, not only because it's likely to make their kids' lives go better, they're likely to be healthier, live longer, make more money, and so on, but because there are social benefits or network effects to having more intelligent people in a population. However, as I'm now going to consider, there may also be good reasons against boosting intelligence. One worry about enhancing intelligence is that a few very smart people might, intentionally or not, inflict vast amounts of harm on other people. A couple of colleagues of mine, when I was writing this book at Oxford, Ingmar Persson from Sweden and Julian Savulescu from Australia, they head up the Center for Practical Ethics there in Oxford, they've argued that we may wish to put the brakes on cognitive enhancement until we also learn how to morally enhance our children, whether this is through drugs or genetics or schooling or whatever. The point is that if we have brighter people but not more morally motivated people, they might actually, with some increased probability, do something really bad. Think of nuclear weapons and so on. Now, I'm going to discuss moral enhancement more in the next chapter, but it's worth recognizing the plausibility of their argument. A smart psychopath, after all, is much more dangerous than a mentally impaired one. More to the point, a world full of cognitively enhanced people is also one in which technology progresses faster, and this brings not only more rewards, but also more risks that a few bad actors might do serious damage. Even cognitively enhanced people might discount the risks of deploying new technology, and with enough risky innovations over enough time, doom could be all but inevitable. In fact, Nick Bostrom has written a paper on this. Nick was downstairs in the building when I was writing this book, and Nick Bostrom has a paper basically saying that you can imagine that you're drawing balls from a particular jar blindly, and there's only one black ball in this giant jar, and you keep pulling up white ball, those are safe, but eventually, with enough innovations that have even some small risk, you're going to draw the black ball. And intelligence enables this. So, this could be a serious problem with enhancing IQ. In George Bernard Shaw's brilliant play, Man and Superman, written in 1903, one of the central characters is the devil and the other is Don Juan. And the devil is arguing with Don Juan and concludes that people tend to invent more peaceful ways of living together, but also more violent ones, more efficient means of killing one another. This is sort of George Bernard Shaw, arguing with himself ultimately. He says, and I quote, I have examined man's wonderful inventions, and I tell you that in the arts of life, man invents nothing, but in the arts of death, he outdoes nature herself. And he produces by chemistry and machinery all the slaughter of plague, pestilence, and famine. The power that governs the earth is not the power of life, but of death. And the inner need that has served life to the effort of organizing itself into the human beings is not the need for higher life, but for a more efficient engine of destruction. The plague, the famine, the earthquake, the tempest were too spasmodic in their action. The tiger and the crocodile were too easily satiated, not cruel enough. Something more constantly, more ruthlessly, more ingeniously destructive was needed. And that something was man, the inventor of the rack, the stake, the gallows, of the electric chair, and of the sword and the gun. Above all, of justice, duty, patriotism, and all of the other isms by which even those who are clever enough to be humanely disposed are persuaded to become the most destructive of all the destroyers. That's George Bernard Shaw in Man and Superman, and I recommend everyone read or watch that play. On this view, even well-meaning people who use destructive technology in the service of ideology might exist. They might emerge. In fact, Nick Bostrom and Anders Sandberg, who share Persson and Savulescu's enthusiasm for enhancement. After all, these guys all endorse enhancement. So did George Bernard Shaw. They've expressed a similar worry about boosting intelligence. They emphasize that, and I quote, education can enhance cognitive skills and abilities, but it can also create fanatics, dogmatists, sophists, skilled rationalizers, cynical manipulators, and indoctrinated, prejudiced, confused, or selfishly calculating minds. In other words, cognitive enhancement through genetic selection can have the same effects as this kind of maleducation, as the kinds of heuristics and cognitive styles that lead us into sophistry and rationalization, especially if these are heritable. If people's ability or willingness to delude themselves is itself partly heritable, if religiosity and personality is partly heritable, maybe the kinds of biases that people can be taught can also to some extent be inherited. And so if we're enhancing their cognitive ability, but also their bias, that could present some real problems. Again, I'm going to consider moral enhancement as a way to mitigate some of these novel risks more in the next chapter. And I think that's actually the most important chapter and one that very few people in the world have actually thought about. What would moral enhancement look like? But before I do that, it's worth mentioning some brief replies to the worry that enhancing cognitive ability will impose these kinds of existential risks that I mentioned. The first, as mentioned above, is that smarter people tend to create more stable and prosperous societies. And in these societies, the rule of law works more effectively, and there are better mechanisms for identifying and catching criminals. This might mean, at the micro level of communities and states, risks will be minimized, and that at the macro level of global associations between countries, trust will be higher and corruption will be lower. So you can imagine, even if there are these rogue actors that pose more danger, we might actually have more robust institutions that can control those rogue actors if we have generally brighter people in the world. The second response to these worries is that banning technologies that allow parents to cognitively enhance their kids is unlikely to prevent everyone from using them. Maybe it can at the margins prevent a few people, but given the enormous benefits these are going to bring for the individual, and given what parents are willing to do for their kids, it's very unlikely that these kinds of restrictive laws could really work very well. In fact, banning them would likely increase the already large cognitive inequalities between different people, since the richest, smartest, and most powerful people would find a way to access black markets for cognitive enhancement in their own society, in another country, etc. And then finally, parents are going to be able to shape the personality traits of their kids through genetic selection. And even though personality is not as heritable as height or intelligence, it's moderately heritable. And conscientious people tend to make more money, do better in school, have more friends and romantic partners, etc. And so what we might find is that conscientious people, as well as brighter people, if we choose to enhance them in these ways, will live more successful lives and treat other people well. And so for these reasons, it's likely that parents will want to select for conscientiousness as well as intelligence. And this can be a form of cognitive and moral enhancement. It can mitigate some of the worries mentioned above. Of course, there's no fully satisfying reply to the worry that brighter people could pose more risks. And that's partly because, again, cognitive enhancement without moral enhancement will bring with it some additional risks. It's really impossible to know exactly ahead of time whether the risks will outweigh the benefits. Some philosophers have a more mundane but still important worry about cognitive enhancement. They argue that boosting intelligence might have some unwanted side effects. For example, a philosopher named Michael Hauskeller cites evidence that smarter people tend to be more prone to depression and perhaps other mental health challenges as a reason to avoid enhancing intelligence. If this were true, parents would need to consider both the potential costs and benefits of boosting IQ. The problem is, for Hauskeller, generally speaking, the best evidence shows the opposite of what he claims. In fact, intelligence is positively, not negatively correlated with mental health, according to huge numbers of studies. So there's only been one or maybe two that you can find that seem to find the opposite, and they're based on pretty small samples and potentially biased samples. Indeed, smarter people tend to suffer from fewer mental disorders overall, including depression, at least across large numbers of people. There may be exceptions, of course. It's possible that you can imagine worlds in which, especially if there are very few smart people, those who see the world more clearly, maybe they experience exceptional joy at, seeing the sunset over the California coast, but they'll also have more awareness of the challenges that humanity faces and the flaws in the world around them. Deep thinkers, after all, aren't usually known for their cheery and naive dispositions. But anecdotes are cheap. In fact, the evidence suggests, again, that mental health is positively, not negatively, correlated with intelligence. And it's really impossible to know for absolutely certain right now, based on all the studies we have, whether there might be some detrimental side effects of boosting IQ. So far, there's just not much evidence. So if the evidence is so strong that increased intelligence has big benefits, why would anyone worry about cognitive enhancement, apart from the reasons that I gave above? We might ask, is skepticism toward cognitive enhancement just a kind of irrational bias in favor of the status quo of where we are now? I don't think so. I think actually we can be pretty charitable toward people's worries here. Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord, the philosophers at Oxford that I mentioned earlier, they invented a kind of heuristic device, which they called the reversal test, as a way of challenging whether or not status quo bias in ethics is irrational. And so what they do is they use cognitive enhancement as an example, but really the test applies to any trait that we propose to alter away from the baseline of where we are now. So here's the test, according to Bostrom and Ord. They say, when a proposal to change a certain parameter, think of height or intelligence or some other average trait, when a proposal to change one of these is thought to have bad overall consequences, consider a change to the same parameter in the opposite direction. If this is also thought to have bad consequences, then the onus is on those who reach these conclusions to explain why our position cannot be improved through changes to this parameter. If they're unable to do so, we have reason to suspect that they suffer from status quo bias. So the idea, again, is take an average of whatever trait you can think of. It could be the probability of getting diabetes, it could be average height, intelligence. If people are worried about boosting it, are they also worried about lowering it? And if not, well, why not? I mean, after all, are we just at some exactly perfect average? People vary quite a bit across individuals and groups, so it'd be kind of odd to conclude that the average of where we are now is exactly right. So think of two examples, height and IQ. Assume that a couple is selecting between 5 embryos. Should they select the one that's in the middle of the IQ or height distributions? Bostrom and Ord's point is that if people express fear about selecting an embryo that is above average for height or IQ, or below average for height or IQ, they may be under the illusion that average is automatically better, that where we are now is special. And it might not be. After all, we're the product of evolution by natural selection, so it's very unlikely that where we are now, given that we're constantly evolving, is just somehow right or about perfect. So Bostrom and Ord are right that we often suffer from status quo bias. And other authors like Powell and Buchanan are right that for a lot of traits, the status quo for a species at any particular point in evolutionary time is unlikely to be optimal. But I do think that some of the skeptics are right here. We should balance this kind of challenge to status quo bias against a principle that defends the status quo. I mean, maybe there is something good about where we are now. And this view, this kind of principle, is often called Chesterton's fence. The idea is from G.K. Chesterton, the British author. And what he says is, look, imagine this. If we're to encounter a fence while we're walking along a road, we should probably try to understand why that fence was built and what purpose that it might serve before we succumb to our urge to move it or to tear it down, right? This is a kind of metaphor for conservatism in general. We see something, it doesn't function perfectly, and then we just tear it down and we hope what comes next is better. Well, it's not always better, right? This is the truth in conservatism. In the case of genetic enhancement, the argument might go, we should avoid making radical changes to the status quo until we understand how we got here and what the dangers of large changes are likely to be. I think this is wise advice for parents and policymakers. So a reasonable conservative like Chesterton might say, look, there are costs to ignoring the subtle consequences that might come if we make large and quick changes to a trait that we care about. This is especially true before we know the total phenotypic consequences of selecting or creating extreme genetic outliers. Now, Bostrom and Ord might reply that there are opportunity costs to staying too close to the exact average distribution of traits that currently exists. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, different ethnic groups have different averages of height and lots of other traits. So a conservative reply to Bostrom and Ord would have to specify which group are we talking about, which set of individuals, and how far should we not be allowed to deviate from the average of that group. So I think basically we can balance these kind of heuristics. We can avoid making truly radical genetic changes or selecting for extreme genetic outliers for some traits like cognitive ability, while recognizing that sometimes we can be reasonably sure that Chesterton's fence is in fact a pointless roadblock rather than a socially significant signpost. After all, many of the disease traits that we've evolved simply don't, serve a good function anymore. You can think of the blood disorders in West Africa, sickle cell anemia, which evolved such that if you have one copy of this gene, you're resistant to malaria. If you have two copies, you are at serious risk of disease and death. Why did that evolve? Well, we understand now. It's pretty clear. It evolved because having one copy really solves a fundamental problem and helps you survive, but two copies doesn't. So would changing that be bad for those people? Would selecting away an embryo with those two copies be bad? I think the answer is obvious. No, it would not be. It would be clearly good. And so in cases like this, Chesterton's fence is a really useful cautionary tale, but it should not hobble our decision to say, look, sometimes we have really good evidence that genetic enhancement is just good. Okay, so moving from general intelligence to specific cognitive traits, including personality traits. If the above considerations are correct, parents will have a kind of defeasible reason and other things equal reason to cognitively enhance their kids and to select for smart kids at least up to a point. But each parent is not all parents, and coordinating our actions in a way that is good for all is challenging. If we can assign polygenic scores to quantify the likelihood that an embryo will develop specific cognitive styles or personality traits, parents are going to face hard choices. Some of these choices might involve moral dilemmas, but many are just going to be a matter of personal taste. For example, evidence indicates that people who score high on conscientiousness and agreeableness tend to be good friends and coworkers, in part because they pay attention to and act on the needs of others, and because they can delay gratification in the pursuit of plans. But being agreeable in the technical psychological sense of that word makes you much more likely to get taken advantage of by others. And it makes you more of a conformist. It's actually not a good thing from a social standpoint. Moreover, conscientious people who are motivated to efficiently pursue goals may be considered less fun to be around. In fact, they probably are less fun to be around if you just want to relax or go to a comedy show or something like that. So you have real trade-offs just from the standpoint of taste for the individual parents, as well as the social trade-offs. Another example is extroversion. Extroverts tend to enjoy more sexual partners. They have more friends. They take more risks. Why? Because, they're not afraid to go out and perform in front of people. But they're also less content to be alone and possibly less adept at solving the kinds of problems that require quiet and concentration and so on outside of social settings. In other words, there are really good reasons to think introverts have advantages over extroverts at doing certain kinds of things and extroverts at other things. Again, parents are going to have different preferences for these traits. And in fact, there's some evidence that when women choose partners, they're more interested in extroverted men. But if they choose a sperm donor, if they go to a sperm bank, for example, a lesbian couple, they're actually about equally likely or more likely even to choose introverts or signs of introversion. So that's kind of interesting. It's a case in which we've got this evolutionary heuristic, and a choice over a partner may be a bit different than a choice over what kind of embryo you want. It's not obvious that choosing someone who's likely to be introverted or extroverted is immoral, right? These are kind of matters of personal choice. But these are simple examples where the heritable cognitive traits that we are going to choose among will have costs and benefits and will lead to very different kinds of lives. From a social standpoint, which I think is more interesting for morality, social policy, economics, there seem to be benefits associated with cognitive diversity. So I don't want to overplay this. Diversity has become a kind of politically correct buzzword, like more diversity is always better. That's not true. However, it is true in some contexts, so cognitive diversity can be quite good. There's something called the Hung-Page theorem. It's a kind of social scientific result that shows that basically, if you have a group of homogeneous but high IQ people, sometimes if you have a heterogeneous group, that is a group of slightly lower IQ people but of very different cognitive styles, under certain contexts, they can better solve problems. And so that's a real argument for cognitive diversity. And we've all seen this in everyday life, right? People think in different ways, and if you're really kind of acting as a team, you each think independently, then you share your results, and you're more likely to solve a problem. Nevertheless, okay, so cognitive diversity clearly has benefits in some of these conditions, and it's conceivable anyway that leaving parents free to select for cognitive traits will produce an overall pattern that's less good from a social standpoint than it might otherwise be. So let's just make this concrete. Suppose we could come up with polygenic scores that people who are using in vitro fertilization, selecting embryos, they can use these polygenic scores to select personality traits. And let's say that these personality traits correspond with political ideology. And in fact, they do. Liberal personality types, for example, tend to exhibit an eagerness to experiment with new ideas and cultures. And here I don't mean extreme progressives on the left. I mean liberal in the classical sense of that word. They tend to be more tolerant. They tend to learn from experience and from outsiders. But people who score high on personality traits that correlate with political liberalism are also more likely to be taken advantage of by others, people who are more parasitic. Whereas conservatives, they may be slower to pick up novel ideas from outsiders, which are beneficial, but they're more likely to protect the existing social and political order from outside threats. And so you can imagine it's plausible that a healthy political society will have a mixture of personality traits that correspond with liberal and conservative political orientations. In cases like this, it's clear that if parents making choices for their own private reasons skewed future populations in one direction rather than another, this will have significant social consequences. In fact, look at countries like Israel right now. Israel in the last 70 years has seen a massive demographic shift where the most religious people have the vast majority of the children, and the least religious people have a lot fewer. So you can imagine after even 3 generations, let alone 5 or 10, you might start to change the actual political dynamics in a society simply by having, people with certain orientations have more children than others. And on a global scale, this has to happen. This is how evolution works. In fact, this is happening not just in Israel, but across the world in the sense that conservatives, and especially religious conservatives, around the world have more children than liberal atheists. Whether this is good or bad, the widespread use of embryo selection can easily alter the political and religious landscape of the human population, or subpopulations that are geographically and politically isolated from one another. It's unclear what to do about social dilemmas like this. Government agents are generally not equipped to find or enact a socially optimal distribution of cognitive traits like personality or political orientation. I mean, they can barely get, taxes right in a way that people are happy with. So we have pretty strong reasons to leave parents free to make these choices on their own, even if their choices will be structured by social norms and enabled by government policy. You could think about policies that subsidize IVF, that make, subsidize not only in vitro fertilization, but maybe even make it cheaper to select embryos or to access genetic counseling, genetic information, and so on. When there are demonstrable collective harms associated with individual choice, it's reasonable to impose some restrictions on choice for the welfare of future people. But it's also not reasonable to think that governments are going to magically solve these problems. So I'm going to get to this much more in the final chapter when I talk about voluntary and coercive eugenics and how overall patterns of reproduction are going to shape future populations. Another way in which cognitive enhancement might be individually rational but collectively harmful is when parents enhance general intelligence or specific cognitive traits in order to pursue positional goods. Now, what are positional goods? In economics, positional goods are usually defined as goods that are scarce and confer social status, so that one person's consumption imposes a relative cost on other people. An example is a medal in the Olympics or admission to an elite school. If I win a gold medal in the Olympics, there's one less gold medal available for everyone else. And in fact, there's only one in the world for each individual sport, right? The ultimate positional good. If my daughter secures a spot in the class of 2040 at Duke University, well, that's one person that can't. The other person that would have gotten if she didn't is not going to get that spot and has to attend another university. This makes the pursuit of positional goods appear to be a negative-sum game. One person has it, then others lose, and after all, we're spending scarce resources to secure a prize that very few people can win. It looks like a waste from a social standpoint. In fact, this is a really important point. These examples are incomplete. I tried to make them plausible because I think they're false. Competition over positional goods imposes net costs only if we restrict our attention to the people competing and the prize that they're competing for. As we all know, though, sometimes the competition itself is worthwhile because it encourages each of us to develop character virtues, or because it's just fun to compete. Training for a football match or studying for an exam can make us healthier, smarter, and more disciplined. And even when there's a loss of welfare for the competitors, because after all, somebody is going to lose in the pursuit of this prize, positive externalities may accrue to everyone and in fact to other parties. When teenage boys pick up a guitar and play on stage in order to impress teenage girls, we may all end up with better music, even if the boy doesn't get the girl. That's an example of a positive externality, a kind of unintended benefit for other people. When entrepreneurs compete for customers to gain money and status, even if they're not especially good people, or when comedians get on stage to overcome their own social anxiety and depression, those who consume the products they create, whether it's a new car or a comedy show, are better off. So competition for positional goods may leave the world with a smarter population, better technology, funnier jokes, better music, and more enjoyable sports. Intelligence, in part, is a positional good, which enables us to tell better jokes, write better stories, earn more money, even access more mates, potentially. It's also an all-purpose good that predicts better health, more stable relationships, and financial success. If parents want to increase general cognitive ability to improve their children's prospects, it's likely to create both benefits for the kid and positive externalities. So I cited evidence above that the positive returns from cognitive enhancement may be exponential rather than linear. This is true even if there are threshold effects above which we get diminishing marginal gains or decreasing marginal utility due to unwanted side effects. We simply don't know yet what the net consequences of chasing partly positional and partly all-purpose goods like intelligence would be. Although again, I suspect that they'll be positive, at least in the near term. The overall lesson of this point is that if each of us enhances the intelligence of our children in order to increase the likelihood that they'll win competitions for positional goods, this doesn't imply that there will be a net loss of social welfare. Quite the opposite in many cases. One reason that free trade tends to increase productivity and peace, in fact, is that it provides each of us with an incentive to figure out what we're good at, and to figure out what other people want, and then develop our talents in ways that tend to be individually profitable, but also collectively beneficial. This fact suggests that not only that enhancing general intelligence may be a net good, but also that leaving parents free to enhance specific cognitive traits is likely to be good to the extent that the traits they choose are socially valued. While parental choice could lead to too much conformity or some other bad distribution of traits, in a free society, it's actually more likely that a diversity of cognitive styles will be in demand by mates and by potential employers, and parents will learn to choose accordingly. There is, however, one serious negative externality that I haven't mentioned, a kind of unintended harm associated with cognitive enhancement. Those who do not enhance their children will clearly suffer relative losses in social opportunities. At some point in the future, and we can imagine especially as AI develops, cognitive inequalities could become so great that different groups of people end up with different moral standing, such that some people are regarded as morally better than others. And this may sound strange, but we can think about, how do we think about human beings compared to other species? We generally think we should treat other species well, but do they have the same rights as us? Not exactly. We don't give pigs or dogs the right to vote, after all. A character in George Bernard Shaw's great play that I mentioned earlier, Man and Superman, warns, "Beware of the pursuit of the superhuman. It leads to an indiscriminate contempt for the human. To a man, horses and dogs and cats are mere species outside of the moral world." Actually, that's not true for Shaw. He was a vegetarian and he cared a lot about other animals. But this is a character in Shaw's book. "Well, to the Superman," he warns, "men and women are a mere species too, outside of the moral world." So the real question is this true? And does Shaw even believe this? I don't think he does. It's just a character giving a warning. And if it is true, what should we do about it? Well, it's clear that those with less intelligence do benefit from living in a society with a high average level of intelligence. Such societies we've seen tend to be richer, less corrupt, and more peaceful. But if economic growth continues as projected, most future people will populate societies that are technologically advanced. And it's not clear that those with less intelligence will be economically valued in a society with less need for manual labor. If cognitive inequality increases, especially substantially, those on the left-hand side of the intelligence bell curve will have fewer opportunities to engage in stimulating social activities and may fare poorly in romantic relationships. Maybe they won't have romantic relationships in a society with smarter people who value creative accomplishments. One question this raises is, might this inequality of abilities eventually produce moral inequality? Peter Singer, a well-known philosopher, has argued that empirical findings about genetically based differences in intelligence shouldn't be taken to undermine the moral principle that people are equals. On Singer's view, all sentient creatures have interests that are worth protecting. What these interests are depends on what kinds of creatures we are. Pigs have different interests than people, but also what properties each of us have. So people with severe mental impairments don't have the same interests as intellectuals, even if they do have an interest in avoiding pain and frustration. So Singer concludes that if we could reliably rank individuals based on intelligence, and I quote, enslaving those who score below a certain line on an intelligence test would not be compatible with equal consideration. Intelligence, as he says, has nothing to do with many important interests people have. I think this is correct within some parameters. Even if Singer downplays the importance of intelligence a bit too much, he's right that we're not committed, we meaning most people are not committed to the idea that every individual has to have an equal amount of whatever qualities gives us basic moral standing. We just need enough. So there are differences between us and chimpanzees that are pretty significant. But, once we hit an IQ of a certain level, we don't need to judge people based on their exact IQ. We just think, look, they've got enough of this trait so that we can, have them as trading partners, respect them equally under the law, and so on. Nevertheless, we can imagine encountering an alien species from another solar system that's much smarter, wiser, kinder, more creative than we are. And it is hard to argue that they aren't better than us in some sense. Just as we say that generally people are better than clams or lobsters. We just simply have so much more capacity than clams or lobsters. It's hard to think that, we should cry equally if we run one over with our car than if we run a baby over with our car. Our capacities don't give us license to abuse the less able, and they may give us special responsibilities to take care of them, but superior capacities above some threshold don't automatically give us superior moral standing, even if there are these threshold effects. Instead, what they do is they give us a sense that having certain rights and responsibilities, it's not strictly proportional to how much of an ability that we have, but there are these kinds of threshold effects where if you have enough, you should be given rights. Alan Buchanan, another philosopher at Duke University, one of my old colleagues, he usefully distinguishes between the concept of moral standing and moral status. And I'm reading a quote from him. This is from his book on genetic enhancement, a book called Beyond Humanity. Buchanan says, moral status and moral standing are sometimes used interchangeably, but I'm going to distinguish them. I will say that a being has moral standing if it counts morally in its own right, but moral status is a more comparative notion. So two beings can have moral standing, like a pig and a person, but one of them may be of higher moral status. Whatever language we use, I think this is right. It's worth making this kind of distinction. Buchanan argues that all creatures with sufficient moral status have moral standing, basic moral rights, but different individuals or groups may have different moral status if the difference between them gets really, really big. I don't want to take a stand on the precise combination of traits that we would need to bestow a creature with, moral standing or moral status. But the point is, these distinctions are worth making when we're thinking about enhancement and thinking about how big the differences might become between people. On Buchanan's view, cognitively enhanced people may have a superior moral status to those who are unenhanced, at least when the differences are big, but he would say all of those people would have a similar moral standing. This view is reflected in the common judgment that the world suffers a greater loss if a kind and creative and bright teenager is killed in a car accident than if an elderly patient who has fallen into a permanently vegetative state is killed by lightning at the hospital. The latter person is basically unconscious, right? They sometimes call them, somewhat unkindly, a beating heart cadaver. There is no mental state in that person. And we think, look, it really is more tragic if this wonderful young person with all this ability is killed in a car accident than that person who's basically got no capacity whatsoever dies in the nighttime. And the truth is, this way of speaking, some people don't like to do it, but, this is a kind of unfashionable way of speaking in a hyper-egalitarian political culture. In our private lives, we all know this is kind of true. We all think that, to some extent, some people are better than others. Some people are just nicer and brighter and more interesting. And that doesn't mean we should abuse the others, but it does mean we do make these kind of subtle moral distinctions. These considerations strongly suggest that increasing cognitive inequality via genetic selection may not only result in some people having more opportunities to productively engage with others, it'll also result in people having superior moral status to others. They will simply be capable of a richer life. This, I'm thinking, in the far future, when the inequalities become truly big. And as inequalities increase and absolute abilities change, those on the right-hand tail of cognitive ability that we deem morally salient, whether it's intelligence or some of their traits, may begin to feel sorry for those on the far left-hand side of the tail. At a point like this, and I'm not advocating this world, I just think this is practically inevitable unless we use some kind of force to make people enhance their children. There are two possible remedies for this situation, which is subsidies against the backdrop of free choice and force. Some people say that we should subsidize socially beneficial enhancements for those who can't otherwise afford them. If some parents refuse to use genetic technologies to shape the cognitive capacity of their children, even if they can afford them because of subsidies, they might eventually be deemed criminally neglectful or negligent, much like parents who refuse to feed or educate or vaccinate their children, and force might be used. I'm not advocating this, I'm just sort of predicting I can imagine a world in which this happened. John Stuart Mill, in his book on liberty, actually said, despite his arguments for liberty, "It is not in the matter of education only," and I'm quoting, "that misplaced notions of liberty prevent moral obligations on the part of parents from being recognized and legal obligations from being imposed. The fact itself of causing the existence of a human being is one of the most responsible actions in the range of human life. To undertake this responsibility, to bestow a life which may be either a blessing or a curse, unless that being on whom it is bestowed will have at least the ordinary chances of a desirable existence, is a crime against that being." These are very strong words from John Stuart Mill, who's actually quite libertarian otherwise. But Mill advocated taking the least restrictive alternative to compel people to acknowledge their obligations as prospective parents, whether it's in the realm of education or, as we can imagine, in the realm of genetic enhancement, which wasn't available when Mill was writing. It's preferable, according to Mill, and I agree, if social norms are used rather than legal sanctions in order to pressure people or enable people to promote their kids' welfare. But if norms fail to work, Mill seems to think that we might coercively prevent parents from reproducing or forcing parents to make certain kinds of choices when making other choices would be extremely detrimental to their children. A less coercive but more radical alternative is to redesign political societies in a more libertarian way so that people have the right to form communities or states with a strong right to exclude those who choose to do very different things than them, whether it's follow different kinds of rules or reproduce in a way that ignores the social consequences of their children's traits. If people were free to form new political communities and set the new rules for entrance and exits, maybe they would cluster even more along the lines of traits that they value, intelligence and so on, and there would be network effects within those communities. Less successful political communities might then copy the reproductive norms of the more successful ones. Of course, there are no guarantees, but small, stable political communities might be able to reintroduce group selection in a way that mimics the conditions that facilitated the spread of favorable psychological traits in the past. And here I'm talking about things like altruism, as well as traits like intelligence or creativity. It may be worth encouraging autonomy among smaller political communities, if for no other reason than John Stuart Mill's idea that we should encourage experiments in living. As the evolutionary biologist Joseph Henrich argues, until we understand psychology and institutions better, and I quote, "We should take a page from cultural evolution's playbook and design variation and selection systems that will allow alternative institutions or organizational forms to compete The idea here is competition would increase in beneficial ways without forcing people to do anything if communities had more freedom to experiment, and if people within communities felt the consequences of their choices more directly than they do in sort of large mass political societies, the kind that we live in now. This could create the emergence of favorable reproductive norms, and it would also mean that cognitive inequalities were less of a problem if people were free to cluster in ways that led them to internalize the consequences of their reproductive and social choices. I'm going to skip chapter 2 for the audio version of the book. In some ways, it's my favorite chapter, but it's also pretty technical. And I think it might be hard to convey the principles of game theory that I kind of rely on for the conclusions, at least for people who are listening rather than reading, if you're driving a car or hitting the gym or whatever it is you're doing. So for those who are interested in reading the second chapter, which is on moral enhancement, you can always just track down a PDF of the book online. And for now, I'm going to move from cognitive enhancement to aesthetic enhancement. Chapter 3, Pretty People. The most beautiful of all Greek deities was Aphrodite. She was often depicted in the nude and was almost always accompanied by Eros, the god of sexual desire. Beauty and sex may be closely associated in many cultures because, if Darwin is right, our aesthetic sense originated in part from the ways in which we evolved to show off and appreciate the traits of potential partners. There's a reason that actors who appear on television and in movies are beautiful, and that radio and podcast hosts have soothing voices. Looking at a beautiful face and listening to sultry voices elevates our spirit and seems to give the message more credibility. In fact, it's well known in psychology that for most people, deep voices and tall bodies convey authority, especially in men. The precise reasons for this are shrouded in our evolutionary history, but the fact remains. We enjoy being in the presence of beautiful people and hearing beautiful voices. People go to great lengths to look good. We spend money on fitness, clothing, cosmetic surgery, hair, makeup. We delete ugly pictures and apply filters to make our best photos look even better. And it's also common to lie about ourselves, our weight, our height, things like that on dating apps. People lie to themselves and to other people in order to send a message to the world that they're beautiful, or at least not ugly. On the other hand, aesthetic enhancement could make us more honest, since we'd have less to lie about if we had fewer imperfections. If beauty is mostly relative, the pursuit of aesthetic enhancement by everyone may be collectively self-defeating, since it would just change the average or move everyone closer to a new average. And if there's a cost to improving our appearance, just like there is with cosmetic surgery or makeup or clothing, or some risk associated with editing embryos to increase our children's physical beauty, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe we'd be better off ignoring aesthetic considerations when choosing our children's traits. Okay, the first section, the origins of beauty. Ever since Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution, biologists have connected our sense of beauty with the ornaments we evolved to display and appreciate during courtship. In The Descent of Man, and the subtitle is And Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin vividly describes how beauty evolves via female choice. And I quote, "I know of no fact in natural history more wonderful than the fact that the female Argus pheasant should appreciate the exquisite ornaments and the elegant patterns on the wing feathers of the male. He who thinks that the male was created as he now exists must admit that the great plumes, which prevent the wings from being used for flight, and which are displayed during courtship and at no other time, in a manner quite peculiar to this one species, were given to him as an ornament. If so, he must likewise admit that the female was created and endowed with the capacity of appreciating such ornaments. I differ only in the conviction that the male pheasant acquired his beauty gradually, through the preference of the females during many generations for the highly ornamented males, the aesthetic capacity of the females having been advanced through exercise or habit, just as our own taste is gradually improved." End of quote. Darwin then extends this logic to cover other aesthetically or other sexually reproducing species, including people. And I quote, "Everyone who admits the principle of evolution and yet feels great difficulty in admitting that female mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish could have acquired the high taste implied by the beauty of the males, and which generally coincides with our own standard, should reflect that the nerve cells of the brain in the highest as well as in the lowest members of the vertebrate species are derived from those of the common progenitor of this great kingdom. For we can thus see how it has come to pass that certain mental faculties in various and widely distinct groups of animals have been developed in nearly the same manner and to nearly the same degree." End of quote. In this remarkable passage, Darwin summarizes the argument that some of the traits we place so much importance on were sexually selected, rather than being transmitted simply because they helped us find food or fight off predators and parasites. In other words, Darwin traces the origin of beauty to sexual selection rather than natural selection. And he endows non-human animals with an aesthetic taste. Think of the birds that he's describing. Darwin believed that females in many species favor males with traits that they consider aesthetically beautiful, not merely useful. According to the mathematical biologist Ronald Fisher, sexually selected traits often begin as honest signals of underlying qualities like health. But, he argued, traits initially favored as honest signals of success in a particular environment can become independently favored by females who find them attractive, even if they fail to indicate anything at all. So you start off with some use, but eventually it sort of ramps up female choice. A hypothetical example is a bright spot on a bird, signaling that the bird can find specific nutrients necessary for health. A female preference for bright colors can, after many generations, become so strong that it leads males to evolve increasingly exotic plumage. Many birds also evolve courtship dances that they can perform in elaborate structures, so-called bowers or homes, that they create specifically for seducing females. Building bowers may begin as a signal by males to females of a capacity for defense. Like, look, I'm capable of building this thing and defending you. But color seems to matter as much as structure. Australian bowerbirds, for example, famously and meticulously decorate complex bowers with bright blue objects to lure females who find them beautiful. Other bowerbirds have different but often equally colorful displays. However these displays began, the female preference for them seems to be an example of runaway sexual selection, as the colors get brighter and the bowers more exotic with every generation. In humans, male height may be an example of runaway selection. Women have a strong preference for tall men, though the preference seems to be for taller than average, rather than merely extremely tall. Height may have begun as an honest indicator of physical abilities like hunting, or the ability to fight off aggressors, but may now be an example of runaway selection, albeit nowhere near as extreme as the peacock's tail or a bowerbird's nest. By contrast, facial symmetry, which is aesthetically desired by both men and women, may be an honest signal of a low mutation load, low oxidative stress, or a low parasite load. Mutations accumulate every generation, and the absence of purifying selection can add up to significant fitness costs. In other words, if you see an abnormally shaped face and it's due to oxidative stress or to, some kind of de novo mutation, novel mutation, on average that person is going to be less fit, you might say. Indeed, according to Jeffrey Miller, sexual reproduction arose probably as a way to contain the damage caused by mutations. William Hamilton initially proposed, and Miller agrees, that sexual reproduction evolved, at least in part, as a defense against parasites, so that by shuffling the genetic deck every generation, our immune system can keep up with the evolution of deadly microbes. And a number of authors have traced facial asymmetry and premature aging to the oxidative stress that occurs when free radicals escape during cellular metabolism. If any of these theories are true, traits that we find beautiful are to some extent an indicator of genetic health. In fact, Amos Zahavi, an Israeli biologist, famously proposed that even extreme ornaments like peacock's tails and bowers' nests are costly signals that indicate fitness rather than reflecting the haphazard aesthetic preferences of females. In effect, costly signals indicate that a male is so powerful that he can afford to be hampered by useless plumage or huge body size that's larger than it needs to be, simply to hunt efficiently. If Zahavi is right, even runaway sexual selection is not capricious, and beauty is not arbitrary. Traits that we think of as beautiful may be honest signals of underlying fitness. So there's a bit of a disagreement between Zahavi and Darwin. Darwin and his contemporary defenders disagree. On Darwin's view, sexual selection can become so divorced from natural selection that it can actually drive a species into extinction. Beauty can be a false signal, or it can be nothing other than a trait that females happen to find attractive, even if it originated in the need to decipher genetic quality. Why does the origin of beauty matter for the ethics of genetic enhancement? Well, first, whatever their origin, standards of beauty for a given species tend to be fairly universal, even if different subspecies may have slightly different standards. Secondly, as mentioned above, beauty often correlates quite a bit with overall health and vitality. Again, think of low parasite load, low mutation load, etc. This suggests that some aesthetic enhancement will actually improve our health. And the converse is also true. Some improvements to our health, for example, editing or selecting out deleterious mutations, will probably also improve our aesthetic appeal. It could do this by making our faces more symmetrical, or by making us more clever if it is a kind of cognitive boost, which is attractive to both men and women. Finally, the evolutionary origin of beauty strongly suggests that pursuing some kinds of aesthetic enhancements may be collectively dangerous, even if they're individually rational. Runaway selection vividly illustrates how individual choice and collective welfare can come apart. It can magnify traits that are good for all, like intelligence and kindness, or traits that are good for each but bad for all. Think of the peacock's tail or male height, which evolved to the detriment of our health. The peacock's tail is so heavy, it's a bird that can't even fly anymore, right? So it's good for each to have a longer tail because they attract more mates, but bad for all to the extent that they can't, fly away as birds, away from predators and so on. Okay, the next section, from cryptic choice to conscious selection. When parents intentionally create children, rather than children being the accidental byproduct of sex, they tend to think about which traits will make their children happy, rather than which traits will maximize their reproductive potential. So they're not explicitly calculating, genetic fitness and this sort of thing. Of course, there's some correlation between fecundity and attractiveness, since our sexual appetites and relationship preferences evolve to track traits like health, strength, intelligence. That would make it more likely that our children would survive and reproduce. But the correlation is not perfect. This is true in part because runaway sexual selection can sever the tie between what's beautiful and what's useful or conducive to happiness. But it's also true because the mating market, think of humans here, the mating market constrains our options much more than the fertility clinic. And because what we find desirable in a partner may differ from the traits that we think will benefit our children. In the fertility clinic, women seem to select traits that they think will lead their children to live a prosperous life. Like men, women care about aesthetic beauty quite a bit, but women consider beauty less important than traits like intelligence and moral character. We can glean this information from a number of sources. The most obvious is to just hand out surveys and ask people what traits they value in long-term mates and what they want their children to end up like. See if the two coalesce or if they're any different. Another is to observe mate choice in the real world through dating patterns, or to examine what traits women value when they shop at sperm banks. As economists like to say, actions reveal preferences. Preliminary evidence on this front suggests that women and men value kindness, attractiveness, easygoingness, and intelligence in long-term mates. For some traits, like intelligence and easygoingness, women seem to find men increasingly attractive up to about the 90th percentile in the population from which their choice is being made. Beyond that, attraction plateaus and even declines a little bit, although it's not clear why. Maybe there are some threshold effects here, and they think you're a little weird if you're really, really smart or really, really tall. This may be because overly kind people are seen as insufficiently ambitious, or exceptionally bright people are sometimes thought to be socially inept. And in fact, I should add, there is a very small correlation, maybe 0.2, between really high intelligence and Asperger's syndrome, which is not necessarily counteradaptive, but not always attractive to women. According to a recent study, when women select male sperm donors, they care a lot about education and to a lesser extent about income. Education and income presumably indicate intelligence and social success. Women also care about the looks of their donor, but less so than intelligence and personality. Since very few men shop around for eggs, of course there are gay men do that, but there aren't that many gay men who are reproducing, we don't really have as good a data for men as we do for women. But we do know that while men seeking long-term partners care about youthful good looks, they also look for general fitness indicators like intelligence and kindness. So men are famously a bit more superficial than women, but that really applies much more to the dating market when they're younger and looking for short-term partners. When they're older and looking for long-term, they converge a little bit more with women on the traits that they care about, intelligence, kindness, and so on. But not all of the things that we find attractive in a mate or traits that we hope our kids will develop are benign. Some kinds of aesthetic enhancement may be self-defeating, and others might be collectively harmful. Still others might be good for those who enhance, but bad for the unenhanced, and considered a kind of unjust source of inequality. Recall that cognitive enhancement seems to create some positive externalities from the unenhanced. This is because smart people are more likely to develop new technology, and more generally, they're likely to create prosperous societies that benefits everyone. High average intelligence strongly predicts national prosperity, after all. Aesthetic enhancement is maybe a little bit less likely to confer aggregate social benefits than cognitive enhancement. Above some level, aesthetic enhancement may be collectively self-defeating, or even conceptually impossible, if beauty is always going to lie along a spectrum, so that the more some people have, the less others have. It's more of a kind of relative trait or positional good. If this is true, some aesthetic enhancement could increase beauty and aggregate welfare, but we may hit a ceiling in terms of quantity and variety. Above that ceiling, more is not necessarily better and may, for the reasons just discussed, produce social costs. Aesthetic enhancement, if this is true, would then be considered a so-called Red Queen phenomenon, which is named after the scene in Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, in which Alice notices that no matter how fast she runs, she stays in the same place relative to the Red Queen and everyone else around her. This suggests that, in principle, there are good reasons to regulate aesthetic enhancement once it hits a threshold, in which improvements are just costly ways of trying to keep up with an average that just keeps moving faster and faster. The economist Robert Frank has argued that sometimes taxing or banning the pursuit of luxury goods like cosmetic surgery is not only good for those who can't afford them, but also for those who can. The same argument could be applied to aesthetic genetic enhancements. The idea is that if everyone is free to pursue a positional good that we all recognize we'd be better off not pursuing, we would actually welcome restrictive regulations, provided they're enforceable and effective. Why? Because again, we'd just be spending more and more without these constraints to just kind of give ourselves a slight positional advantage. But if everyone is doing that, well, it's going to get costlier and costlier to keep up. Suppose, to take the example of genetic enhancement of our children, suppose that we select for tall sons and curvy daughters, knowing that these traits are considered both sexually attractive to potential partners and likely to raise our kids' social status. We might do this because conventionally beautiful men and women are likely to earn more income, and there's really good evidence for this, and are more sexually attractive to mates than their less beautiful counterparts. It's conceivable that as we enhance these traits, preferences for them will also ramp up. Ronald Fisher showed that genes which code for a sexually selected trait are likely to be linked with those that tend to produce a preference for that trait in the opposite sex. In the environments that we now live in, very tall people are more likely to suffer joint injuries because they carry around extra weight, and they may suffer unhealthy heart conditions due to an increased ratio of body size to heart size. And women with large breasts may be more likely to suffer from back injuries, as well as having to carry around extra weight that isn't especially useful. Shapely breasts have no effect on breastfeeding, but instead seem to be purely sexually selected. So despite the reasons we have to try to prevent aesthetic arms races through regulation, there's still pretty good arguments in favor of freedom to pursue these enhancements. So I mentioned some costs, health costs, and so on, but there are good reasons to leave the market relatively free, I think. And here they are. First of all, there may be upper limits to some aesthetic positional goods. So we can take an example focusing on the body. Men in all cultures are attracted to a fairly similar waist to hips ratio for women, and women are attracted to a similar shoulders to waist ratio for men. Just take an example from the face, men and women are attracted to both symmetry and averageness. But once you reach these, you have pretty much perfect symmetry and you're kind of right in the average of the population. Different body ratios or more facial symmetry do not become more attractive. You've kind of hit the limit. Even aesthetic features that appear to be purely positional goods, such as curviness in women and height in men, may not generate an endless arms race if there are health costs associated with enhancing them beyond a certain point. The kind of careful deliberation that would go into selecting embryos is unlikely to elicit the visceral attraction that occurs during courtship. Parents will presumably care more about their children's physical health and mental well-being than superficial traits. Second, conventional cosmetic surgery is expensive and invasive, and some genetic enhancements might actually preclude the need to pursue these kinds of aesthetic enhancements. As income goes up, and it typically does across generations, many people spend more and more money on surgeries to erase wrinkles, chemicals to whiten teeth, hair dyes to color hair. And we could think of the same thing for genetics. Genetic enhancement will eventually be safer and cheaper than cosmetic procedures to the extent that it might slow the aging process or delay the onset of gray hair, muscle loss, or wrinkles. In other words, it'll select in favor of sort of health longevity and also aesthetic longevity. Genetic enhancement might also produce a texture of hair or nose shape that is universally desired, which would obviate the need for expensive hair treatments or dangerous cosmetic surgeries. You could think of the infamous problem of male baldness, right? We spend so much money, looking for a cure for this. There's no upside to male baldness. Nobody likes it. Women don't like it. Men don't like it. And if you could just prevent it through genetic enhancement, you actually save money. You don't actually cost more money. In other words, genetic enhancement can reduce health risks and financial costs associated with cosmetic surgery that future people might otherwise pay for. So this is again another argument that, well, even if there are theoretical arms races with genetic enhancement, in fact, genetic enhancement might prevent some arms races that already occur. The third reason to think this is that some traits that we consider unattractive are due to deleterious mutations, that is, harmful mutations. If we can select or alter embryos to minimize harmful mutations, even those not related to any particular body feature, beauty and health are likely to increase as a byproduct, especially for those with a relatively high genetic load. So the idea here is if you've got some recent mutations that are harmful, basically they might give you a misshapen face, they might make you a little dimmer or a little shorter than you would otherwise be. And even if the point of this is not to make you more beautiful, in fact, beauty would be a byproduct of removing these. Still, once this threshold is reached, it looks like continual efforts to enhance beauty, at least conventional beauty, would be collectively fruitless. Finally, in a world in which information flows freely and the cost of medical tourism decreases, a reason that we should think that regulations on genetic enhancement will not be great is because they'll be easy to violate. Parents will likely be able to access genetic information about aesthetic traits, even if the information is censored by a specific country or medical association. After all, people already travel to places like Mexico or Colombia to save money on cosmetic surgery that they can't access in the United States, just as they travel to places like India to purchase a life-saving kidney, even if the market is illegal in the US or in India for that matter. Why? Because there are enough poor people in certain countries that are willing to sell their body parts. There's no reason to think that they won't do the same thing to alter or select an embryo, given the massive potential benefits for their children. Although social norms may be effective at influencing our reproductive choices, if our choices are made in private, one thing we could do is impose rules that make people's choices public. I don't support this, but you can imagine if we could make their choices public, we could actually subject them to social pressure that might come from healthcare professionals or other people who observe those choices. And then shame might lead them to actually, might disincentivize frivolous or dangerous aesthetic enhancements. I don't know that would be worth the cost, but it's just an example where a social norm could in principle be preferable to a law that sort of tried to make these things illegal. Anyway, for all of these reasons, I think that coercive regulations, even if they're well-intended, these coercive regulations to attempt to block the pursuit of positional goods will probably be unnecessary and for the most part ineffective. It's of course impossible to say ahead of time the extent to which this is true, but more importantly, laws that are intended to block these kinds of expensive arms races may actually just exacerbate unfair inequalities. I already mentioned this in the first chapter when we talked about cognitive enhancement, but basically, if only the rich and well-connected can afford to get around these laws and do medical tourism, if one of the reasons to kind of control these arms races is to protect the poor, well, what you end up doing accidentally is inadvertently hurting them even more. Why? Because the rich typically have ways of getting around these laws. Okay, I want to say a bit about aesthetic discrimination, because this becomes a real issue when some people can enhance and others can't. While aesthetic beauty can indicate genetic health, the correlation is quite loose, and many of us end up unfairly judging people on the basis of their attractiveness. According to Anjan Chatterjee, and I'm quoting, "Attractive children are considered more intelligent, honest, and pleasant, and are thought to be natural leaders. Taller men generally make more money and are thought to be more competent." The correlation is so strong that people who are thought to be powerful, think of Hollywood actors like Tom Cruise or leaders like Winston Churchill, they're assumed to be taller than they actually are. Philosophers have a term for this. Some of them call it aesthetic discrimination, others lookism, which is sort of like racism or sexism. I don't really like that term very much, but you can see the point. People are often unjustly stereotyped based on their aesthetics. Now, there is some small correlation between extreme deformity and, lower intelligence. If you're much shorter than average in your population, there's a small correlation between low intelligence and being short, but it's so low that it's really not enough to justify these kinds of judgments people make. So, what do we do about these kinds of things? Well, we all rely on heuristics in everyday life, kind of rules of thumb by which we judge people. And we generalize on the basis of cases that we've personally experienced. I guess we would call these stereotypes. These are kind of generalizations about groups. And contrary to what a lot of elites in academia and journalism want to believe, many of our stereotypes are surprisingly accurate. Lee Jussum, a psychologist at Rutgers, actually has a number of books on this, on stereotype accuracy. Moreover, acting on the basis of stereotypes can be perfectly rational when information is limited, even if it's sometimes morally questionable. Just to take a simple example before I criticize it, if you're walking down a dark alley, you may find yourself more afraid of a 20-year-old man than a 60-year-old woman who's moving toward you. Even if this fear is misplaced in a particular case, it's based on experience, and of course, it's generally speaking a fully justified prejudice. So statistical generalizations can be completely epistemically reliable, and sometimes even morally good ways of narrowing down a pool of, for example, potential job applicants, mates, or partners on a sports team. If you're choosing who's going to be on your basketball team and you're just looking at a bunch of people in front of you, probably the guy with muscles and very little fat is going to outperform the guy who's really fat and skinny and has small muscles. Not always true, but as a stereotype, it's probably going to work most of the time. The problem is that sometimes acting on the basis of stereotypes is morally wrong, even when the generalization that underlies it is generally rationally justifiable. This is true when acting on stereotypes makes members of some groups much worse off than they would be if we judged them as individuals. So, for example, fearing a young man in a dark alley is perfectly rationally justifiable, but using aesthetic attractiveness to assess the competency of an applicant for a job is not only not rational in terms of your own goals, but it's also morally wrong. In the case of aesthetics, it may be difficult to avoid making judgments about people, but given the negative consequences of constantly being judged badly simply on the basis of our looks, we have pretty strong moral reasons to encourage compassion toward people who are regarded as ugly. We should also protect them against egregious forms of legal discrimination at work and at school by cultivating norms of respect and maybe passing legal restrictions against certain kinds of aesthetic discrimination. It's not to say that, companies should be forced to hire unattractive people to advertise their clothing or their makeup brand or whatever, but it does seem like we should permit people to sue for unjust discrimination if they have conclusive evidence that they were fired or mistreated just on the basis of their looks. Nevertheless, the most effective response to discrimination on the basis of mere looks may be actually to empower parents to select embryos that will minimize some of these like facial deformities, extreme asymmetries, and other cues of ugliness. Disability advocates sometimes emphasize that this response fails to deal with the underlying problem, which is discrimination that's unjust. Of course, they have a point. Sometimes we should change our reactions toward other people, especially when those people can't change their appearance or their ability. We can also change our environments to make it easier for people to navigate them. Think of wheelchair access that's even mandated by law to help people who can't walk. These aren't mutually exclusive. We can teach tolerance and make it harder to act on our biases, but we can also, and we can improve the environment for people with disabilities, but we can also intervene with genetic technology to minimize the extent to which disabilities exist and create these kinds of personal and social costs to begin with. Inequalities in arms races. So far, I've argued that universal access to aesthetic enhancement might be paired with attempts to encourage compassion and impose laws meant to reduce unjust aesthetic prejudice. But this doesn't solve the more fundamental problem that inequalities of beauty may be an inevitable part of ordinary human life and the lives to come when genetic enhancement technologies become ubiquitous. The philosopher Robert Sparrow argues that parents who attempt to genetically enhance their children will impose relative costs on those who opt out. And of course, he's right. In the case of aesthetic enhancement, this might mean exacerbating aesthetic inequalities that now exist. But unless we take where we are now as morally special We can turn Sparrow's argument on its head and use it to defend universal access to genetic technologies that foster aesthetic enhancement. If inequalities are likely to increase when some choose genetically enhance their children and some don't, this may be a reason for everyone to enhance rather than for everyone to refrain. Of course, there will probably be inequalities either way, but not all inequalities are unjust. And this is a really morally important point. Some people treat inequality as just automatically a bad thing. We seem to have evolved this moral heuristic, at least some people anyway, to think this way, and I think it's just not the case. If parents can easily alleviate a condition like low intelligence, disability, or ugliness through genetic selection, but they refrain from doing so out of a sense of allegiance to an abstract egalitarian principle, this may be an argument against the principle rather than a reason to restrict using genetic technology for aesthetic or any other kind of enhancement. Failing to use genetic technology when it's safe and cheap, and when it's unlikely to be collectively self-defeating for a group, may eventually even constitute criminal negligence. I'm not arguing for this, but actually some have. Refraining from a safe and beneficial genetic enhancement may be on a par with parents refusing to allow their child to be vaccinated against an infectious disease simply because not everyone in the world has the same opportunities. That would be an odd thing to do. So maybe someone somewhere in the world can't afford a vaccine, and so you say, well, I'm not going to vaccinate my kid. I mean, that doesn't seem exactly right. There may be reasons to try to spread access to scientific and health innovations to all, but this doesn't mean that those who can afford such opportunities should be forced to forego them until everyone else has the same opportunities. There will always be differences in access to goods, and sometimes as a necessary consequence of an efficiently functioning market. In a market system where private property and free exchange are protected, those with more wealth or risk tolerance buy new products first. This allows the products to be evaluated for safety and to become cheap enough through mass production that those with less wealth and more risk aversion can eventually enjoy them. There's no principal difference between automobiles, clothing, all these other products that through market exchange become better and cheaper over time, and genetic enhancement. The morally salient fact here about genetic technologies is that they're going to allow large inequalities of ability to emerge quickly, probably more quickly than some of the other things I mentioned, which is a bit more troubling than inequalities in access to, say, designer clothes or exotic food. Inequalities in intelligence or beauty could lead to more discrimination against the unenhanced, and a general level of contempt by the able toward the unable. Remember the example I gave from George Bernard Shaw, where he sort of says, look, to the Superman, mere men are going to have this inferior moral status. That's one possibility. This is one reason to support the dispersion of a basic tier of enhancement technologies via government subsidies. And just as an aside, outside of the book, over the last year or two, places like China, Israel, a number of countries have actually announced that they're going to subsidize universal access to IVF. And that's partly to solve the problem of falling birth rate. But as it turns out, when you make IVF cheaper, you also make enhancement cheaper. And it may be that in the near future, as more companies come out of the closet about doing pre-implantation genetic testing, governments will cover not only a basic tier of in vitro fertilization, but also of pre-implantation genetic testing. Eventually gene editing, who knows? Subsidies are unlikely to fully solve the problem of a transition period during which some have access to a transformative technology while others are left behind. Solving this problem, to solve it, some argue that essentially all enhancement technologies should be made available as a matter of public health. But given the fact that new and presumably patented innovations will be very expensive to subsidize, providing immediate universal access would be controversial in rich countries and impossible in poor countries. The reason it would be controversial at best and impossible at worst is that there's an innovation versus access trade-off with new technologies. There's also legitimate moral disagreement about which technology we should have access to first. The trade-off results from the fact that allowing rich people to invest in products that may eventually benefit everyone speeds up the production of these products. But equalizing access typically involves coercively taxing wealthy people in order to subsidize everyone else. When it comes to aesthetic enhancement, very few people think it's worth subsidizing universal access to every new discovery about how to edit or select embryos to create prettier people. As I've argued, beyond some basic aesthetic improvements, especially those that correlate with genetic health, a lot of aesthetic improvement is likely to involve chasing positional goods of relative beauty. And in these cases, especially, subsidies would actually be collectively self-defeating, even if access to a basic tier of aesthetic enhancement can be morally justified. Chapter 4 is about enhancing our children's health by using reproductive technology to minimize inherited disease. This is probably the most obvious case for using embryo selection and eventually gene editing. But after reading parts of Chapter 4 out loud, I decided not to include it in the audio version of the book since, like Chapter 2, parts of it are a little bit too technical for a good audio experience, I think. So I decided to skip ahead to the final chapter, which covers spicier topics like how our reproductive choices will shape future populations, including their political orientation, what we can learn from the history of eugenics, whether we should clone geniuses, or people with other traits that we value, like beauty, creativity. And I'm going to discuss how the ability to create life from scratch, which is still a distant possibility, but a very real one, will raise new ethical questions that we've really never faced before. Okay, Chapter 5, Synthetic People. The Greek goddess Cassandra was cursed with the ability to predict the future without the ability to change it. As far as the distant future goes, we are all Cassandra. The laws of physics imply the bleakest of all possible futures. All living things, all conscious life, presumably will cease to exist. Entropy ensures this, but how and when that will happen is almost entirely up to us. For some reason, dystopian novels like Brave New World are more popular than utopian or even just mildly optimistic accounts of the future. Maybe a certain amount of pessimism is built into us, being predisposed to believe everything will turn out just fine, regardless of our choices, is not a recipe for success, especially in evolutionary terms. So it makes sense that we're the descendants of creatures who are restless and anxious about the future. But if political stability can be maintained in at least a few productive countries, we have reason to believe technology will continue to advance, enabling genetic enhancements of the kind mentioned in the previous chapters. In this chapter, I'll review some reasons for short-term pessimism, mainly rooted in demographic trends, and reasons for medium and long-term optimism. I'll begin by considering the moral consequences of the still remote possibility that we can create people from scratch, hence the title, Synthetic People. And then I'll discuss how the ability to radically reshape entire populations through genetic enhancement is likely to influence our political institutions, our opportunities, and our lives, or rather our descendants' lives. And I'll end by asking whether we should reproduce at all, why we should reproduce at all, and whether we should be worried if we remain a single species. In 2008, Craig Venter and his team in San Diego announced that they had created life from scratch. By 2010, they constructed the first self-replicating bacterial cell by reverse engineering an existing bacterium called Mycoplasma genitalium. At a press conference, Venter announced that, and I quote, "This is the first self-replicating cell on the planet to have a computer for a parent." By 2016, the third version of the cell was created, serving as a blueprint for a synthetic bacterium with the minimum number of genes needed to survive and reproduce. The self-replicating cell that they created isn't very impressive on its face. It doesn't do much other than eat sugar and make copies of itself. But the feat is one of the greatest achievements in human history, since it shows that we can, in principle anyway, reverse engineer life and build new kinds of life from chemicals that are easy to obtain. The fact that the ingredients to build life are ubiquitous doesn't mean it's easy to create, but it can be created, clearly, especially when its steps are simplified and automated. Synthetic biology is a rapidly growing field that allows scientists to take common amino acids and, with the help of the right lab equipment, transform them into strands of DNA called biobricks that can be used to alter or build organisms. The amount of information required to understand and even build the simplest self-replicating cell is enormous. So synthetic biology could not have emerged until chemistry, physics, and genetics had become mature sciences well into the 20th and 21st centuries. And computation had become powerful enough to sift through vast amounts of data faster than people can. But it's here. Synthetic biology is going to transform our world by giving us new kinds of food, allowing us to create new forms of life, and indeed resurrect old forms. That's one of the things that George Church wants to do. And it will enable us to transform into a new kind of creature. Whether we can sexually reproduce with ordinary humans or not is probably less important than what kinds of traits we end up having in the distant future. It's conceivable, barely, that through a similar process we might direct a perhaps artificially intelligent machine to string together amino acids and build an embryo from scratch. The resulting cell could then be implanted in the uterus of a willing woman or potentially incubated in an artificial womb. Artificial wombs have been extensively discussed, partly as ways of helping premature children be born in a healthy way. but they're really not necessary for constructing synthetic people or a synthetic genome. They would just save women the inconvenience of pregnancy, or allow us to have children on other planets, for example. The real barrier is the staggering complexity of understanding and synthesizing the billions of base pairs that comprise a human genome, and creating the embryo from which an artificial person could develop. If the process becomes feasible, and I think it will, it's easy to imagine at least some women wanting to carry a synthetic embryo to term because they were interested in creating a child that way, or perhaps because they were paid to do so. This is not much different today from women who act as surrogates for a friend's baby, or who accept payment in order to be a surrogate for a woman who can't herself conceive, or in some cases for some celebrities, they just simply prefer not to go through pregnancy, maybe because they're busy or they just have other things to do with their time. One reason people might have synthetic children is that they could construct genomes from scratch that lack deleterious mutations and some of the genetic vestiges of viruses that afflicted our ancestors and that litter our chromosomes. Another is that we might add genetic variants that enhance whatever traits we're interested in. We might even use this kind of technology to transmit the data for assembling people on other planets, in other solar systems, with bodies that are better adapted to different conditions. After all, the nearest solar system is pretty far away. Even the planets in our own are very far away, and it might be cheaper and more efficient to just reconstruct life on other planets than to travel there. In this sense, humans could colonize other planets without leaving our own. In principle, we could also create genetic replicas of ourselves on our own planet or on other planets, assuming that people or some other form of intelligent life has colonized those planets and would faithfully carry out our plans. Synthetic replicas would not be psychological replicas. They would share our psychological dispositions because they share our genetic code, but they would have very different experiences and end up as quite different people. Assume for the moment that all of this is possible. Sending plans for how to construct a particular kind of living thing from one place to another is technologically challenging, presupposes a much deeper understanding of genomics than we have now, and it requires the relevant ingredients, a hospitable environment, and a willing executioner for our plans. But it is conceivable, and it certainly doesn't violate any known laws of physics. Would we want to do this? Well, I can't answer for everybody, but I think many people would. We might see it as a kind of immortality, although we would lack any psychological connection to a genetic replica of ourselves born somewhere else. We wouldn't suddenly wake up in a new body in a different place. Replicas would instead function like a twin, born in a different time and place. We might even see replicas, or edited versions of them, as a kind of survival, in the sense that parents live vicariously through their genetically related children. We all wish our lives were different at various stages, that they went better, or, we learned more from our experience, and many people seem to take joy in thinking of their kids as versions of themselves who might learn from their parents' mistakes. Indeed, this is why it's common for parents to give their own name to their children. They see it as a kind of immortality. There's nothing wrong with living vicariously. It isn't immortality exactly, but it's similar in some ways. And if we generate enhanced versions of ourselves, we would be conferring benefits on another person that would presumably make their lives go better. So it doesn't seem to have any obvious moral problems. Okay, reproductive rights and responsibilities. Would there be a right to have children in a world in which we could create many copies of ourselves at very low cost? In the world we live in now, procreative rights are often taken for granted. Because resources are limited and the cost of having a child is high, most people simply don't ask the question, do we have a kind of unlimited reproductive right? They just assume that we do. But the idea of a boundless reproductive right seems pretty misguided, just like almost any other boundless right. In their pioneering book on genetic justice, From Chance to Choice, published in the year 2000, Alan Buchanan and his co-authors argue that, and I quote, significant portions of the costs of having children are externalized in virtually all societies. That is, borne by others besides the parents or children. The more this happens, the greater a claim these others might make to have some say in and control of the costs imposed on them. I would just add, as an aside, it's not just that other people's children impose costs on your children, they also confer benefits. And so in that sense, we can imagine in the future where people had the capacity to create huge numbers of children, or even small numbers, but who are significantly modified, the benefits or the costs would be significantly bigger. In many modern countries, these costs include medical care, education, childcare, welfare programs that involve coercively collecting tax revenue and redistributing it from those who earn more money to those who earn less. The response to this in future political societies could go in one of two directions. Some political communities may want to decrease the extent to which we bear the consequences of one another's reproductive choices, maybe by repealing social welfare programs. Others may want to retain a society with more socialized resources and benefits, but encourage encourage some people to reproduce more and others to reproduce less than they would if they were left to their own devices. In fact, genetically enhanced people might provide such large social benefits that the citizens of some political communities would be willing to compensate people with widely admired traits for having more kids, donating sperm or eggs, or paying other people to raise their kids. Just as the costs of reproduction are often socialized in communities that share institutions and resources, so too are the benefits. And we all might benefit tremendously if there were smarter, kinder, more attractive, more creative people in the population. While paying people to have children may seem like we'd be turning them into reproductive machines, back to Brave New World as I had mentioned earlier, surely some people would be willing to do this for financial or reputational rewards. And as an aside, this isn't actually in the original book, but interestingly, the author of Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, was a proud member of the English Eugenics Society. And not only did he not intend Brave New World to be an anti-enhancement book, it was more of a book about warning about government propaganda and government control. He actively wrote another book in which he advocated paying people or incentivizing people who were smart and creative and interesting to have more children. So Aldous Huxley himself was, in that sense, a eugenicist. Some might consider it a worthy sacrifice to have children with widely admired traits, especially if the people who emerge are likely to achieve great things like creating new kinds of art, solving socially significant problems. One way this might happen is to reward women who bear children from embryos created from couples or clones of individual people who are widely admired for their virtues or accomplishments or aesthetic traits. If women weren't willing to bear children for some political community or for the sake of humanity, perhaps some governments would force them to do this. This is, of course, a nightmare scenario, but you could imagine this happening through a kind of reproductive slavery. We can imagine them using the kinds of methods that indeed appear in Brave New World to sift people in genetic castes and reproductive roles to which they don't consent. The prospect of a dystopian government, however, is, and this is probably the most common ethical objection to genetic enhancement technology, but I don't think it's especially well placed. The worry that any kind of enhancement or any amount of state coercion, like subsidies, will lead to dystopian science fiction scenarios, I think is not especially plausible. Not all slopes are slippery, as they say. In fact, government coercion in the reproductive realm already exists in a very light form. Think of, for example, bans on cousin marriage or incest, the goal of which is to prevent genetic harms. Bans are, after all, coercive government action, and the point of it is to get a certain genetic consequence or prevent bad genetic consequences. There are also widely accepted norms that stigmatize reckless reproduction, and as more is known about heritable diseases and polygenic traits, some might support measures that prevent parents from knowingly implanting embryos with serious genetic diseases like Tay-Sachs, or a psychological trait like psychopathy or sadism. This could be done with information campaigns, stern advice from genetic counselors, and at the limit, of course, prohibitions on selecting embryos with these kinds of conditions. Even if parents don't know the relevant genetic facts, in fact, you can imagine in the future they might be held responsible for creating wrongful life. And I put that in quotes because that is a legal category. If these facts should have been known by the parents, especially in a society with genetic counseling and easy to access information. I think this is actually unlikely for most societies, that parents would be held legally accountable or responsible for giving birth to children with serious genetic defects, so to speak. But again, it's sort of something you could imagine. Think of the kind of government that exists in North Korea or China right now, for example. Less starkly and more controversially, some might think parents should be barred from having children that are likely to have very low intelligence, poor self-control, or severely attenuated empathy. After all, these traits are not only highly heritable and likely to lead to a life of frustration for the child, they're also likely to impose costs on others. In fact, interestingly enough, although I don't support this, a recent survey shows that people's attitudes toward coercive eugenics is closely tied to their perception of how heritable a behavioral trait is. This is interesting. Actually, I do support this. I do, in some sense, sympathize with this. It makes some sense. Here's an example. Support for sterilizing violent criminals significantly increases when people believe, correctly, that criminality is moderately heritable. Now, I think one way of interpreting that is not just that they don't want criminals who are violent to have a lot of children, but also it's probably a reason to think those people are not capable of being reformed. And that probably is true. After all, when we look at violent violent reoffenders, psychopaths are especially well represented. So you can imagine when people find out how heritable psychopathy is, and it is indeed very highly heritable, they might have a little bit less sympathy for correctional programs. The same goes for encouraging bright parents to have more children and dim parents for having fewer, when people believe that traits like self-control and aggression and intelligence are highly heritable. Parents in rich countries already face significant restrictions on how they can raise their children. They're required by governments to feed and educate them, to vaccinate them, and provide them with shelter and supervision. Given these widely recognized responsibilities that kick in after a child is born, it's hardly a stretch to think that we should also impose responsibilities before birth, even if these responsibilities aren't as extensive as the ones I mentioned. As David Benatar, the South African philosopher, says, if it is wrong to inflict a hardship on an existing person, then, barring any special considerations, it's also wrong to inflict the same hardship on a future person. The moral principle here is simple. Procreative choices are wrong to the extent that they bring a person into existence whose life is expected to go very poorly. Expected is an important qualification because no parent can know with certainty whether their child will exhibit a particular set of traits. Even if they screen an embryo, they ensure prenatal health, raise their kid with affection and education, and so on. Developmental noise, factors that are hard to predict or control, can affect the pathway from embryo to child, and genetic predispositions are not destiny, of course. Parents can be blamed if they fail to take adequate precautions against a pregnancy that, given widely available knowledge, is likely to produce a child with especially grim prospects. Again, think of traits like psychopathy, sadism, extreme poor health like Tay-Sachs disease. Most of us recognize that procreation brings special moral responsibilities with it. However, the move from morality to law can be hard to justify. There's a difference between recognizing a parent's moral obligations, for example, to refrain from drinking too much alcohol while they're pregnant, and arguing that the state should enforce these obligations in a particular way. The same is true for genetic screening. For this reason, while giving governments some ability to regulate reproduction may be wise, I think we have really good reasons to be skeptical of governments that claim extensive power over people's reproductive choices. Demographic worries. For at least the last century, rich countries have witnessed an astonishing pattern. As income and female education rise, fertility falls. Fertility in the rich countries of Europe and East Asia has fallen so fast in the past few decades that many demographers now talk about a demographic winter. The pattern that has emerged is this. As people become wealthier, they gain more opportunities to do intellectually stimulating and hedonistically satisfying things with their time, and they seem to care less about children. They also get sucked into careers that uproot them from relationships and community, especially in sort of free market societies. Although the pattern began before the advent of the birth control in rich countries, reliable contraception and decreased religiosity seem to have played a role as well in changing social norms so that people could enjoy the pleasure of sex without the consequences of children. And as more people do that, it becomes a social norm to do that. So for example, the average person, some would call them an NPC, a non-player character, most people just sort of watch what other people do and they copy it. So if your favorite celebrities or your family members or whatever have one child or zero children, well, that's going to make it more likely that you think 0 or 1 or maybe 2 at most is the optimal number. And when people around you are having 4 or 5, well, that tends to affect your choices. What happened? Well, we hacked our biology and made it possible to bypass the natural point of sex. We changed our environment so that children were no longer needed to care for parents in old age, which was one reason to have kids. We became less religious, which severed the link between marriage and children. And we created cute companion animals like dogs and cats, which provide some of the emotional satisfaction, especially to women, that would have previously been provided by children. Social welfare programs also provide enormous benefits, especially for the vulnerable and people who are temporarily unemployed or injured through no fault of their own. But robust welfare programs have also changed social norms and altered patterns of reproduction so that the state, rather than a particular guy, becomes the father of children. Even Charles Darwin worried that, and I quote, "With savages, the weak in mind and body are soon eliminated, and those that survive exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, which give them free resources, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one, Darwin says, who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. About 70 years later, the Nobel laureate Erwin Schrödinger echoed this concern in his groundbreaking lectures on the nature and origin of life in 1956. Schrödinger emphasized that evolution works by variation and selection, but that, and I quote, "this whole mechanism appears to be blocked in civilized man, in some respects even reversed. We are, generally speaking, not willing to see our fellow creatures suffer and perish, and so we have gradually introduced legal and social institutions, which on the one hand protect life, condemn systematic infanticide, to try to help every frail or sick person survive, while on the other hand, they have to replace the natural elimination of the less fit by keeping the offspring within the limits of the available livelihood." Both Darwin and Schrödinger were deeply ambivalent about this, since social welfare programs clearly improve the prospects of the most vulnerable people in any population. A related but rarely appreciated phenomenon, first discussed by a different Nobel laureate, Hermann Muller, is the problem of rising deleterious mutation loads in modern populations. Deleterious just means harmful mutation. Historically, more resources would have led to more fertility, not less. This generated variation in a population and meant that natural selection would eliminate people with genetic mutations that led to poor eyesight, a proneness to cancer, etc. But in rich countries, we can easily treat poor eyesight with surgery, glasses, or contact lenses. And we can treat childhood cancers, which would have killed you before reproduction, and other disorders with at least a partly genetic cause with increasingly sophisticated medicine. Again, this is an enormous boon for human health and welfare, but it also means that deleterious mutation load is increasing, which is a strong argument, I think, in favor of genetically modifying our children, or at least allowing parents to do that, as the technology becomes more feasible. Earlier, we explored the metaphor of Chesterton's fence, which holds that we shouldn't tear a fence down until we understand why it was built. But Chesterton also developed an opposing metaphor, which I'm coining as Chesterton's post. Here's the metaphor. Conservatism, Chesterton says, is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them as they are. But you do not. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must always be painting it again. Briefly, if you want the old white post, you must have a new white post. Another way of thinking about this in the context of genetic modification is we may need to modify our children simply to stay where we are now, given the cumulative cost of novel deleterious mutations. And I mentioned the reasons for that. Darwin gave his reasons, Schrödinger did too, and I mentioned from Muller this idea of novel mutations not being sifted out through war, through disease, through famine, and through simply having poor medical care. Apart from the risks associated with mutations, we've already seen that traits like intelligence, empathy, and a constellation of traits that matter for human welfare are moderately to highly heritable, which implicates a partly genetic cause. We've also seen that average intelligence is a good predictor of social stability, and empathy is in many ways the foundations for morality. If the average level of either of these was to decline in a population, it would not bode very well, either for the individuals who comprise the population or for the group as a whole. Charles Darwin recognized this in 1874 in The Descent of Man, and he says, I quote, "It is most difficult to say why one civilized nation rises, becomes more powerful, and spreads more widely than another, or why the same nation progresses more at one time than at another. We can only say that it depends on an increase in the number of the population, on the number of men endowed with high intellectual and moral faculties, as well as on their standard of excellence, sort of social norms and morality they abide by. In other words, the welfare of groups depends on the heritable traits of those who comprise them and on the moral norms and political institutions that create social order. These facts are intertwined, as we've seen. Culture is connected with and in many ways downstream from biology. Culture shapes us, but different kinds of people give rise to different cultures. For example, in the last few years, scientists have discovered that new kinds of societies to which agriculture gave rise altered people genetically. Agriculture and eventually small cities allowed for more inequality, and it often rewarded virtues like intelligence, patience, and other personality traits that enable people to flourish in conditions that require long-term planning. So again, think about why would you get more inequality? Well, in a kind of agricultural society, if you're a bit brighter than the next guy, that can actually pay off really well. And being bright, maybe you come up with a new invention for harvesting crops more efficiently, or new ways of organizing people to work better. And maybe you end up with 4 or 14 wives, and, instead of 1 or 2 children, some of whom may even die in childbirth, you end up with 100 children. This has to have happened over the last, say, 10 to 15,000 years. So you get more inequality, but you also get these other interesting genetic consequences. But as the Industrial Revolution hit England and spread to the world, wealth skyrocketed, enabling the formation of a robust welfare state. So we had these old conditions where you had more inequality because of agricultural societies and some people being able to hoard resources or to gather more resources rather when they were more productive. That allowed for more stability, longer lives, better lives in general, even if they lacked some nutrients because they were eating monocultures. But again, what ends up happening is the population expands, and then suddenly the Industrial Revolution hits, wealth skyrockets, and this enabled the formation of a welfare state. This allowed the children of people who were poor or sick or unemployed to survive and reproduce at much higher rates, and actually, paradoxically, led to lower fertility by the rich and successful. And that's partly simply because of the choices they now had available for how to spend their money and how to spend their time. Charles Darwin was dimly aware of this pattern thanks to his cousin Francis Galton, who discovered key concepts in statistics, who invented psychometrics and many other fields, and founded the eugenics movement. Eugenics has become a dirty word in popular culture because of its excesses in the early 20th century, including forced sterilization laws in the USA and Germany, which were applied to the feeble-minded, as they put it, but also sometimes just to sexual deviants or epileptics, because genetics just wasn't very well understood in the early 20th century. So obviously a lot of that was bad, but a lot of the criticism of eugenics conflates what Galton and Darwin and other modern academics and bioethics mean by eugenics, which is just, choosing traits that enable our children to thrive. They conflate this with how modern Nazis misuse the term. So I think we should definitely caution against this. So there's a kind of conflation. We hear the word eugenics, and what some people seem to mean is just shaping the traits of our children, and what others mean is, massive coercion, by governments like the Nazis. Moral grandstanding in connection with this term has become so common that journalists often use eugenics to mean something like unjust coercion of innocent parents. I think this is stupid. This is journalists just misusing terms because they're lazy or because they have a certain ideology to promote. But Galton and Darwin would have rejected this. They were much more subtle thinkers, and I think we should too. Let me give you a better definition, a kind of neutral one that, you could apply in ways that are either good or bad. And this comes from Leonard Darwin, who's Charles Darwin's son and past president of the Eugenics Society of England. According to Leonard Darwin, eugenics is the study of heredity as it may be applied to the betterment, mental and physical, of the human race. What I like about this definition is it's clear. That doesn't mean eugenics is necessarily good or bad. It just means we're using the study of heredity to try to improve the human race. We may fail it. We may actually improve it a lot. We may make it worse, but this is a kind of neutral definition of what eugenics is or what it aims to do. While people disagree about precisely which traits are worth promoting, what motivates eugenics is a concern that individual welfare depends in part on the average traits of a population, and that demographic trends matter to the extent that they influence the success or failure of entire populations. Apart from demographics within countries, there's a massive divergence in fertility trends across countries, one that has never been seen before on the planet. The rise in wealth and education in Europe and then East Asia has produced falling fertility, and it has for quite some time in Europe. It's really going on a couple of 100 years now. But global population is still rising, although that too is projected to stop in about 30 to 40 years. Financial aid from Europe and North America, places like Canada, the US, and so on, to Africa, mostly in the form of food and medicine and other technologies, along with the discovery of oil in North Africa and the Middle East, has contributed to an unprecedented population boom in the poorest countries in the world. So as Europe's population is declining, African populations are absolutely exploding. And even the Middle East and Southern Asia has also exploded in recent years, although that is starting to turn in recent years. Meanwhile, many environmentalists and journalists, people on the political left for the most part, in Western countries, are calling on people in those countries with really, really low fertility rates to have even fewer children. I mean, this is truly dangerous and insane in my view. But their argument to try to treat it with some respect is that, well, when we have additional children in a world of scarce resources, it's going to contribute to more pollution, deforestation, climate change, other environmental threats. Okay, fair enough, that may be true, but the argument leaves out the global benefits of population growth in countries with stable political institutions and populations of people that actually contribute quite a bit to the world. Think of what, a place like Japan or Sweden or Canada does. They're contributing outsized contributions to music, technology, science, industry. If the argument to have fewer kids is most likely to be heeded by educated and compassionate people in developed countries like Switzerland, it'll actually produce the opposite of its intended effect by suppressing scientific innovations that otherwise would have been developed. And that includes, by the way, innovations for controlling pollution. If environmentalists are so worried about pollution, the last thing they'd want to do is suppress population in places like Switzerland or Sweden. That's where all of the people with the most concern for pollution is. They have very low levels themselves. And that's where all the inventions that help fight pollution come from. Think of alternatives to the internal combustion engine. Yeah, maybe that kind of engine was developed for the most part in Europe, but also electric engines and nuclear power and so on are also developed there. So this raises a question that I suppose is implicit in many journalists or academics' sort of question about whether we should have more or fewer children. And that is, why have children at all? And it is kind of an interesting question that most people haven't asked for most of human history. They just sort of had children. But historically, people have had kids for a bunch of different reasons. The most obvious is, like other animals, sex is fun and kids come along as a byproduct, or because our religion or community enjoined us, as the Bible says, to be fruitful and multiply. A religion that didn't do that wouldn't be very successful. Or because we needed children to help work the land on farms or to take care of us in old age. We didn't have social security programs. And because in more recent times, people find having kids to be part of a fulfilling life. So there are these kinds of unconscious and then conscious reasons that people have kids. Some have argued that, and this is a pretty grim view, but it's worth addressing. Some have argued that, on balance, most human lives involve more suffering and harm than benefit, so we should stop reproducing altogether. This is an uncommon view, but there are a fair number of people who hold it. And indeed, David Benatar, the South African philosopher I mentioned earlier, has argued this in a book called Better Never to Have Been. The problem is that even if this were true, even if life in general is a net harm, it can presumably be changed through deliberate genetic selection or modification, so that the calculus actually tilted in favor of life being a net benefit. Assuming that life is or could become a net benefit, we might increasingly encounter a reproductive collective action problem. We've seen that many wealthy, educated people have below replacement fertility rates, and this is only dropping as I record this audiobook, dropping fast. That is, they have too few children to keep the population stable. So for example, the populations of Italy and Spain are projected over the next 3 decades to fall by something like 30% unless something happens to the birth rate. They do this in part because higher income and more education allow them to enjoy opportunities that are unavailable to the poor. And I'm thinking especially in liberal, irreligious societies. People think of new ways to just kind of have fun because they're not thinking about obeying a kind of divine commandment to be fruitful and multiply. If we assume future people would benefit from smart, compassionate, educated people having more children now, it looks like we have a kind of intergenerational free rider problem. If life is valuable and future life has the potential to be better than it is now, maybe we have a moral obligation to have children, or at least some of us do. Morality evolved in part to solve local collective action problems like hunting together, waging war, or keeping the local environment clean to prevent infectious disease. We each do our own part, and then collectively we're all better off. Our moral emotions and social norms are, in effect, devices that help us override our tendency to think in purely selfish terms. This is the point of morality. But these emotions and norms are not especially good at solving global intergenerational collective action problems because the benefits are too distant for most people to recognize the consequences of their actions or to care much about them. This presents special problems when we're confronted with global pollution, species extinction, or, as I just put it, reproductive patterns that determine who is born and how well off they're likely to be, or how many people are born. While it is rarely discussed in polite company, having children may be the most important moral obligation we have, provided we're likely to rear happy and healthy children. There's a reluctance, I think, to acknowledge this obligation because having children is, of course, very personal and it radically alters the direction of our lives. It can even make us a little bit more miserable in the first few years of children's lives, depending on the kid. But often, really rowdy kids can make us lose sleep, and women in particular undergo physical alterations that can be difficult for a few months. Overall, though, having children can be part of a good life, obviously, and it may make us happier if it encourages us, and here I'm reviewing some social science, which says that it does indeed encourage us to engage more with our community and give us more of a sense of meaning outside of ourselves. In other words, having children can help us connect to other people, to past, to future, in a deeper way. Perhaps the reason that an obligation to reproduce is not widely recognized, or at least discussed, is that some people can't have children. Though this, of course, will change with surrogates and with induced pluripotent stem cells, or what I called in vitro gametogenesis, and artificial wombs, perhaps. Of course, we shouldn't shame people for failing to do something they can't do. As moral philosophers like to say, ought implies can. So if I can't have healthy children, there's obviously no obligation for me to reproduce. But saying most people have a moral obligation or a moral reason to reproduce does not commit us to saying that everyone does, or that our moral obligation should be backed with coercive laws that force us to reproduce. Should we stay a single species? Toward the end of the first chapter, I discussed whether if some people genetically enhance their children and others don't, future people might eventually end up with unequal moral standing. I concluded that even if there are thresholds rather than gradual slopes that determine our moral standing, inequality could become significant enough to give different groups of people different moral standing. I don't see that happening in the near future, but maybe in a couple of generations. While it is true that, as we are now, people count more than clams or lobsters, it is also true that being just a bit brighter or more empathetic doesn't make one person morally better than another, or giving them some other different status, different rights, and so on. People who meet a basic threshold are entitled to a certain amount of autonomy, respect, and so on. But with enough assortative mating, or with the repeated use of genetic enhancement technologies across generations, we are likely to either become a separate species from those who decline to enhance, or at least have such large differences in ability that we can't live together productively. We would want very different things, and enhanced people may regard unenhanced people with pity or contempt. Perhaps the enhanced wouldn't think of the unenhanced much at all, in the same way we currently don't think much about the inner lives of squirrels or cats. Is this a moral problem? Might it give us reasons to reject enhancement, maybe even ban it? I don't think so. First of all, I think it's wrong to prevent some people from having more simply because others don't have as much. Some people are inclined to take a snapshot of the world. I get this phrase from Robert Nozick, sort of snapshot of the world, and infer from this inequality that there's some kind of unfairness. But of course, we can have an inequality of money, for example, for a lot of reasons. Like maybe someone down the street from me has a lot of money because a robber came and stole it from his neighbor and put it in his pocket. In that case, it clearly is unfair. In another case, somebody has more money than someone else because they worked more hours at some valuable job, or, some charity gave it to them and they're about to give it to someone else. There are lots of reasons for inequalities of resources, and that doesn't mean they're all unfair. People who do sort of incline to this view, though, falsely believe that for someone to have more, someone else must have less. And economists have a name for this kind of mental mistake. They call it the zero-sum fallacy, which reflects the widely shared but misguided belief that inequalities require gains and losses, or gainers and losers. In reality, if you're a good doctor, you probably earn more than a lot of your patients, but your patients are better off for your presence than they would be without it. Similarly, genetically enhanced people are likely to create innovations that the unenhanced cannot create but benefit from. And morally enhanced people may in principle make the world a safer and nicer place to live by stabilizing political institutions and promoting pro-social norms that benefit everyone, including the unenhanced. And you can see chapter 1 for evidence of that. And of course, if you want to look up the studies, feel free to look at the visual, the written version of the book. A second reason not to worry about these inequalities too much is that legal prohibitions on enhancement that are intended to prevent genetic stratification would be very difficult to enforce and may actually produce moral consequences that are worse than the inequalities that they're intended to prevent. Some people, for example, have called for blanket bans on genetic engineering and cloning. I've already discussed why I think this isn't desirable and it's not feasible, mainly because of medical tourism and black markets. But even among scholars who recognize that unilateral bans are unlikely to work, some have called for a global treaty to ban genetic engineering technologies. The costs associated with enforcing a global ban would be enormous. In fact, it would plausibly require absolute political power across different countries with a kind of police state or a global police state to ensure that nobody violates the prohibitions. Even then, there wouldn't be guarantees. Why would the police themselves or the politicians who order them to arrest sellers and buyers of genetic technology comply with the laws? Kind of like with drug and alcohol prohibition, right? It often ends up benefiting the authorities who are tasked with regulating it. Think of the drug trade in the 1980s. Who benefited most? It's sort of, to some extent, the cocaine dealers who could charge higher prices as long as they didn't end up dead. They actually ended up quite rich, like Pablo Escobar. And the DEA, who was tasked with regulating them. They often used the drugs, they sold the drugs, and so on. So what would prevent this sort of technology from being any different? Bans on genetic enhancement will be especially difficult to enforce in low-trust societies with high levels of corruption. Many modern states are large, multi-ethnic, and multicultural, and such societies, although they have economies of scale that benefit from large numbers, like a military and infrastructure, they often also create a kind of recipe for lower trust and more division. And in these kinds of societies, I think it's very difficult to pass coercive laws that are especially difficult to enforce. So in cases like this, citizens who push for prohibitions on enhancement against the will of a sizable portion of the population will ultimately just create the conditions so that those who are closest to political power can access the resources that others can't. Instead of moral and legal prohibitions to prevent inequalities, I think it's more plausible to suppose that different kinds of people will want to separate into different political communities. They would do this, for example, if government welfare programs socialize the benefits and costs of productive work, or if unenhanced people would in various ways undermine the welfare of enhanced people, maybe by trying to sabotage their society. And think of the movie 12 Monkeys, for example. Separation, that is political separation, need not be violent or involve animosity. It could reflect the reality that groups have become so different that even if they can still interbreed, they can't live together productively. I mean, this has happened for much smaller reasons. Think of, irreconcilable differences between religions. So India and Pakistan separated only 60 or 70 years ago because, Muslims and Hindus were just fighting more when they lived together than when they lived separately. So they separated. That was a somewhat violent separation, but not actually that bad in terms of how those things often go. And you could just imagine lots of cases in which people say, look, we have very different goals, very different views of what the future should look like. My group is very conservative and religious, and we just want to keep our current ways of living, and you guys want to enhance yourselves. Why don't we separate politically? In other words, separation could reflect the reality that groups have just become so different that even if they can interbreed, they'll want to live apart, simply because this is safer. If, as the philosopher John Rawls says, a political community is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, and there can be little or no reciprocity between very different kinds of people, there's no point in sharing political institutions. This would require rethinking the moral foundations of large nation states, the kind that many of us live in now. And one cost of allowing smaller, more decentralized political communities is that they tend to be stable only when there are high entry and exit costs, and they tend to have less privacy, for example, than we would expect. This would require rethinking the moral foundations of the large nation states in which many of us now live. One cost of allowing smaller, more decentralized political communities is that they tend to be stable only when there are high entry and exit costs. So you get the sort of population continuing to live in one place, and less privacy than we expect in large cities like New York or London. But this may be a cost worth paying in order to prevent unnecessary animosity or violence between groups with very different capacities to cooperate on mutually beneficial terms. Okay, and now for a brief conclusion. Most people don't think about how genetics is going to reshape our world over the next century. Even among those who understand the science of embryo selection and gene editing, many are currently skeptical of using it. Some of this reflects a legitimate concern that we don't yet know enough to alter complex traits. And for some of those traits, that's true, actually. But some of this is just an unjustifiable bias in favor of the status quo. An analogy can be made with genetically modified food. Some people have expressed legitimate worries about the consequences of genetic modifying food. For example, they worry about environmental risks, or they worry about too much genetic similarity, which is a problem that has to be managed among crops. Others wonder whether we know enough about nutrition to ensure that genetically modified foods have all of the nutrients we would get from natural crops. But a lot of the fear simply comes from using new technology. I mean, after all, we've been genetically selecting crops for a really, really long time. If you pause the book and look up pictures of what corn or wheat used to look like 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, it's very different. And when we talk about deliberate modification through gene editing, so far at least, the science is pretty clear. Genetically modified food is just as nutritious, and in many cases cheaper and more nutritious than traditional crops. And it's far better for the environment, even if we do have to worry about and guard against monocultures. It can also help us avoid the need to spray crops with pesticides, since we can build disease resistance into genetically modified plants or crops. Popular opposition to genetic modification of food is beginning to fade as the consumption of it is more widespread. It's likely, I think, that a similar pattern will emerge for genetically enhanced embryos. At first, a few wealthy technophiles are likely to use polygenic risk scores to increase their children's intelligence or select for aesthetic traits like height and eye color. At the same time, some religious leaders may object to reproductive technologies like in vitro fertilization or in vitro gametogenesis on the grounds that parents will create embryos and then destroy most of them. And that, of course, is true. That's what they'll do. Other objections will emerge from political egalitarians, who are in some ways the opposite of religious conservatives, in places like the USA, where an ideology that emerged after the Second World War has led elites in the media and in universities to deny the role that genes play in socially valued traits like intelligence. Because the dominant view among American elites, at least as I'm writing this book, in the early 2000s, is that only oppression or discrimination, not genetics, can explain social disparities between individuals and groups. Because they think that, many journalists, professors, public intellectuals will initially condemn the technology. This is because they'll understand that if polygenic risk scores can predict important life outcomes for embryos, the same is true for people in general, and this fact is going to quickly conflict with and undermine their worldview. Because the implications of this is so obvious, and because ideology is hard to shake, I think a lot of elites will engage in a kind of moral grandstanding. They will publicly condemn the technology in order to declare their fealty to the dominant political ideology, but they'll probably privately be using the technology at the same time. And as the technology improves, it will lead to more cognitive dissonance among elites who want to use embryo selection to give advantages to their own kids, but who are ideologically committed to opposing it. And eventually, I think what'll happen is, and it's hard to know how quickly, but in some period, some years, more elites will openly use the technology, and a kind of preference cascade will cause more people to move from reluctance and condemnation to support for embryo selection and eventually gene editing. Norms and technology will co-evolve as the cost of opting out of using technology or genetic technology grows. At that point, at least within some societies, there may be social pressure to avoid old-fashioned birth, as they see it, and pressure to carefully screen children for traits that predict healthy, happy lives. Indeed, there are already signs that social taboos against genetic selection are weakening. In the year 2023, a group of scholars published a survey of American attitudes toward embryo selection. The survey gauged three things: parental attitudes toward using tutoring and schooling to boost their kids' chance of gaining admission to an elite university. It also gauged their attitude toward using embryo selection or gene editing to accomplish the same goal. Nearly half of Americans said they consider using embryo selection to boost intelligence morally justifiable, as well as something they would personally consider. Only a slightly lower percent said they would use gene editing to accomplish the same end, assuming it was safe. More importantly, younger people of reproductive age were more favorable than older people toward genetically enhancing their kids. And this suggests that attitudes are changing, and that when you put a price on moral grandstanding, when it becomes actually viable for people of reproductive age to do something, where there are big benefits to doing it, they're more likely to adjust their attitudes toward the possibility that they, in fact, can do it and will do it. This suggests that attitudes are changing, and that while elite opinion often shapes ordinary people's attitudes, taboos against genetic enhancement are likely to fade once the cost plummets and the technology matures. Some people may continue to reject enhancement, and after many years, I think genetic divergence would occur. If the cost of opting out of genetic enhancement is felt by those who opt in, and the cost becomes very high, as mentioned a little while ago, political separation is likely to result. And of course, this is morally preferable to forcing people with very different abilities and goals to live together in a common political community. That's a recipe for tension and hostility. However, if the unenhanced pose a threat to the enhanced, perhaps because they have access to technologies created by the enhanced, but maybe they lack the foresight, patience, or moral constitutions to interact on peaceful terms, they might be coerced to either enhance their kids or be prevented from having children at all. We are the product of evolution by natural selection. The environment has changed us by culling our ancestors who are poorly adapted to past conditions. And we've changed the environment in ways that make it more likely that people with particular traits will have more children than others. There's never been an essential or pan-human nature that's stable over long periods of time. We all differ from each other and we constantly evolve. Evolution doesn't stop. And in this sense, genetic modification isn't new, even if the tools are. What is new is the ability to make conscious choices about the traits of our descendants. Evolution is path dependent. Future populations will be shaped by the choices parents make now. These choices, in turn, will be influenced by the social and political institutions that they live under. It's up to us to think through what kinds of institutions we want to create and what kinds of future people should exist.